Somewhere in the oldest corners of Pokemon's universe, a creation myth unfolds quietly, hidden behind tales the games never fully explain. An egg waits in absolute nothing, responding to laws that must literally exist before existence can begin. From that single moment, all of time, all of space, all of matter flows outward. And before we drift off, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an upload, and let me know where you're watching from, and the story it unfolds at the edge of existence itself, in the moment before beginnings were possible, when Arceus took shape inside an egg, drifting through the void, carrying the first spark of reality into nothingness. The egg itself is never fully explained in any game, or text, or interview with developers who built the mythology. It simply existed, hovering in a space that could not be called space, because dimensions had not yet formed. The shell contained something that would become everything, a being whose awakening would tear apart this fabric of non-existence and replace it with structure and law. When the shell cracked, time began to flow, and that flow created the first measurement of change in a universe that had known only stillness. Arceus, described in ancient texts discovered in the Sinnoh region, is referred to as the original one, a title that carries weight beyond simple naming. The Pokemon's form, vaguely equine with a golden wheel circling its body, represents completeness and totality. 18 plates orbit the creature in some depictions, each one representing a fundamental type of energy that would later define how all Pokemon interact with the world. These plates were not created separately from Arceus, but emerged as part of its essential nature, fragments of its being made tangible, so that lesser creatures could one day harness similar powers. The first act Arceus performed after emerging from the egg was to create Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, three beings tasked with governing the fundamental forces of reality. Dialga's birth caused time to begin flowing like a river, establishing past, present, and future as distinct concepts. Before Dialga existed, there was no before, no sequence of events, no causality linking one moment to the next. The creation of this Pokemon transformed the void into a place where things could happen, where change could occur, where history could begin to accumulate. Palkia followed, and with its emergence came the stabilization of space itself. The void that had contained only Arceus and Dialga suddenly expanded outward infinitely, creating dimensions and distances and the possibility of separation between objects. Ancient texts describe this moment as the destruction of walls, though what those walls represented remains unclear. Perhaps they refer to boundaries that existed in the pre-space void, invisible barriers that prevented expansion. When Palkia was born, those barriers shattered, and the universe grew vast and infinite. Giratina came, third, created to govern antimatter and serve as shadow to Arceus's light. But Giratina's nature proved too violent, too chaotic for the ordered universe being constructed. Arceus made a decision that shaped all future events. Giratina would be banished to the Distortion World, a realm where the laws established by Dialga and Palkia did not apply. In that place, time does not flow forward, space does not follow geometric logic, and gravity shifts without pattern. Giratina became the sole inhabitant of a world designed to contain its power, a prison and a kingdom both. The Distortion World exists parallel to the regular universe, touching it only at specific points where the barriers between realities grow thin. Spear Pillar, the ancient temple built atop Mount Coronet in Sinnoh, marks one such intersection. At this place, under specific conditions, the boundaries can weaken enough for Giratina to emerge, or for travelers to enter its domain. Cynthia, the Sinnoh region's champion and a scholar of mythology, suggests that Giratina possesses the ability to merge the two worlds if both face existential threat, though this ability might require Dialga and Palkia to be incapacitated first. After establishing the fundamental forces of reality, Arceus turned its attention to creating beings that would govern the mental and emotional aspects of life. 3 small Pokémon emerged: Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, collectively known as the Lake Guardians. These 3 were not as powerful as the creation trio, but their influence would prove equally essential to the development of consciousness across the universe. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos, and let me know where you're listening from tonight. Uxie's birth gave beings the ability to solve problems, to think, to accumulate and process information. This Pokémon governs knowledge itself, residing in Lake Acuity, where it remains largely hidden from the world. Legends warn that anyone who gazes directly into Uxie's eyes will instantly forget everything they have ever learned, their memories erased as if they had never existed. This defensive mechanism ensures that Uxie can protect the knowledge it embodies without risking that power falling into hands that might misuse it. Mesprit followed, and with its emergence came emotion. Joy, sorrow, anger, love, fear, all the feelings that give life texture and meaning flowed from this being's birth. Mesprit chose Lake Verity as its home, a body of water named for the truth of feeling, the honesty that emotions bring to existence. Unlike Uxie, Mesprit is known to leave its lake occasionally, wandering the region and observing how emotions shape the lives of Pokémon and humans alike. Those who encounter Mesprit often report feeling overwhelmed by sensation, as if every emotion they had ever suppressed suddenly surfaces at once. Azelf completed the trio, bringing willpower into existence. This Pokémon gave beings the power to act, to choose, to exert their desires upon the world. Without Azelf, creatures would possess knowledge and emotion, but lack the drive to use them. They would exist in a state of passive awareness, unable to transform thought into deed. Azelf dwells in Lake Valor, its name reflecting the courage required to exercise will in the face of uncertainty. Legend holds that Azelf can drain the willpower from any being that threatens it, leaving them unable to move or think or care about anything. The Lake Guardians serve as a bridge between the cosmic forces embodied by Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina and the more immediate, personal aspects of consciousness that define an individual experience. Their creation marked a shift in Arceus's work from establishing universal laws to enabling the development of life that could experience and appreciate those laws. With time flowing, space stable, and consciousness possible, the universe was ready for its next phase. What happened next remains one of the most debated topics in Pokémon mythology. Ancient texts provide conflicting accounts, and modern researchers have developed multiple theories to explain the emergence of the remaining legendary Pokémon and the origin of ordinary species. The first theory suggests that Arceus continued its creative work, directly forming legendary Pokémon like Kyogre, Groudon, Rayquaza, Regigigas, and Mew. Each of these beings would shape the physical world in different ways, transforming the empty universe into a place rich with land, sea, sky, and life. Kyogre, according to this theory, embodied the ocean itself, its massive form containing enough water to flood entire continents. Groudon represented land and magma, capable of raising mountains and expanding dry ground wherever it walked. These two titans engaged in an ancient battle that shaped the early planet, their conflict creating the geography that would later be home to countless species. Rayquaza emerged as a mediator, dwelling in the ozone layer and descending only when the balance between land and sea threatened to collapse entirely. Regigigas, a colossal Pokémon strong enough to pull continents across the planet's surface, sculpted the world's landmasses into their current configuration. Ancient texts describe this being towing entire subcontinents by ropes, repositioning them to create optimal conditions for life. After completing its work, Regigigas fell into a deep slumber, resting in a temple far to the north, where the cold would preserve it indefinitely. 3 smaller Pokémon, Regis, Regirock, and Registeel, were created to guard it, each one formed from fundamental materials and given consciousness. Mew, the final Pokémon Arceus created in this first theory, became the ancestor of all common species. Its genetic code contained possibilities for every type of Pokémon that would eventually evolve, a living repository of biological potential. Mew's playful, curious nature drove it to explore the world, and wherever it traveled, new species began to emerge through natural evolution. This theory positions Mew as a bridge between divine creation and natural process, a being crafted by Arceus, but operating through mechanisms that resemble Darwinian selection. The second theory contradicts the first in fundamental ways. According to this interpretation, Arceus created only the essential framework beings, Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, and the Lake Guardians. Everything else, including legendary Pokémon like Kyogre and Groudon, emerged spontaneously from the natural processes set in motion by that framework. Pokédex entries for Primal Kyogre and Primal Groudon describe them as formed deep within the earth, suggesting they arose from planetary processes rather than divine will. Under this theory, Mew still plays a crucial role, but its origin differs. Perhaps it was the first species to emerge naturally, shaped by the conditions Arceus established. Once Mew existed, it became the progenitor of all other Pokémon through evolution, its unstable genetic structure allowing it to adapt and diversify into the thousands of species that populate the world today. This interpretation treats legendary Pokémon as extraordinarily powerful but still natural beings, products of their environments rather than direct creations of a deity. Evidence for this second theory appears in various Pokédex entries and ancient texts that describe legendary Pokémon forming from natural phenomena. Ho-Oh and Lugia, the tower duo of Johto, are said to have emerged from the elements themselves, Ho-Oh from rainbow light and sacred fire, Lugia from silver wind and deep ocean currents. The legendary beasts of Johto, Entei, Raikou, and Suicune were reborn from ordinary Pokémon who perished in the burned tower, resurrected by Ho-Oh's power rather than created ex nihilo. The truth likely combines elements of both theories, with some legendary Pokémon directly created by Arceus and others emerging through natural or semi-natural processes. The mythology was never meant to provide a complete, consistent answer to every question about origins. Different regions developed different stories, and those stories changed as they passed through generations of storytellers. What remains consistent across all versions is the role of Arceus as the ultimate source, the being from which all else flows, directly or indirectly. Mew's status as ancestor of all Pokémon deserves deeper examination. The creature appears in ancient texts from multiple regions, always described as rare and elusive. Its ability to learn any move, to transform its appearance, and to disappear at will suggests a being operating outside normal biological constraints. Modern genetic research in the Pokémon world has confirmed that Mew's DNA contains sequences found in every other Pokémon species, a discovery that lends credibility to its role as a common ancestor. But this genetic connection raises questions. If Mew truly is the ancestor of all species, when and how did it first appear? If Arceus created it, Why make a being whose genetic code contains potential for forms that did not yet exist? One interpretation suggests that Arceus created Mew with knowledge of what the world would need, encoding possibilities for future species into its DNA like a divine blueprint. Evolution would then be a guided process, with Mew's descendants following paths already sketched out in their genetic inheritance. An alternative interpretation treats Mew's genetic connection to all species as metaphorical rather than literal. Perhaps Mew did not directly give birth to every Pokémon lineage, but instead represents a common evolutionary ancestor, a species from which all others diverged millions of years ago. Its ability to learn any move and transform its body might be evolutionary remnants, vestigial abilities retained from a time when adaptability was necessary for survival. Modern Mew would then be a living fossil, the last survivor of a primordial species that once dominated the planet. The relationship between legendary Pokémon and ordinary species remains complex throughout Pokémon mythology. Some legendaries, like the Lake Guardians or the Weather Trio, clearly operate on a different level than common Pokémon, their powers shaping reality itself. Others, like the legendary birds of Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, seem more like exceptionally powerful members of their respective types, rare but not entirely unique. Sightings of multiple Articuno in different regions suggest these Pokémon might be a species rather than individuals, though their rarity prevents definitive confirmation. This ambiguity extends to the concept of what makes a Pokémon legendary. Is it uniqueness, power, connection to natural forces, or simply cultural significance? Arcanine appears in ancient texts alongside Articuno and Moltres, described as a legendary Pokémon despite being a species that can breed and produce offspring. This designation might reflect how humans in ancient times perceived these creatures rather than any inherent cosmic significance. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. The creation myth establishes the cosmic framework, but understanding Pokémon lore requires examining how that framework influenced specific regions and their histories. Each area developed its own relationship with legendary Pokémon, and those relationships shaped the cultures, conflicts, and mythologies that modern trainers encounter. The Kanto and Johto regions, being among the oldest settled areas, contain some of the deepest layers of historical mythology. Kanto's legendary birds represent elemental extremes, Articuno embodying ice, Zapdos wielding electricity, Moltres commanding fire. Ancient inhabitants of the region viewed these three as forces of nature, given form, creatures whose presence signaled seasonal changes or weather patterns. Articuno appeared during harsh winters, bringing blizzards that tested the survival skills of both Pokémon and humans. Zapdos manifested during intense thunderstorms, its electrical power causing the phenomena rather than merely accompanying them. Moltres dwelled in volcanic regions, and legends claim that wherever it flew, the very air grew hot enough to combust. These three birds operated independently, each following its own patterns and purposes. Unlike Kyogre and Groudon, whose conflict actively shaped the planet, the legendary birds existed more passively, their presence affecting local environments, but not engaging in titanic battles. This passive relationship made them less central to regional mythology than the creation trio of Sinnoh, but still earned them reverence and fear from human populations who lived in their territories. Mewtwo's existence introduces an entirely different element to Kanto's legendary landscape. Unlike the naturally occurring legendary Pokémon, Mewtwo was created by human scientists who sought to clone Mew and enhance its powers through genetic manipulation. The project took place on Cinnabar Island, where researchers worked in secret, funded by wealthy patrons who saw potential military applications for a controllable legendary Pokémon. The experiments succeeded in creating a living being, but failed utterly in their goal of control. Mewtwo awoke with immense psychic power and immediately recognized its nature as an artificial creation. The Pokemon's rage at being brought into existence for exploitation led it to destroy the laboratory and then everyone inside, escaping into the wilderness where it struggled to understand its place in a world that had not naturally produced it. Unlike Mew, which had a clear role in the cosmic order, Mewtwo existed outside that order, a being with no intended purpose except to serve masters it refused to acknowledge. The psychological torment of Mewtwo's existence forms one of the darker elements of Pokémon lore. The creature possesses intelligence equal to or exceeding human capability, allowing it to ponder questions of identity, purpose, and morality. These questions lead to suffering that purely natural Pokémon likely never experience. A Pidgey does not question why it exists or whether its life has meaning. Mewtwo cannot help but ask these questions, and the lack of satisfying answers drives much of its early rage and isolation. Journal entries recovered from the burned remains of Cinnabar Mansion reveal the progression of the Mewtwo project. Early experiments focused on successfully cloning Mew from preserved DNA samples discovered in a remote jungle. Once cloning succeeded, researchers began enhancing the genetic code, modifying sequences to increase psychic power, physical durability, and intelligence. Each modification pushed Mewtwo further from its natural template, creating a being that resembled Mew only superficially. The lead scientist's final entry, dated the day before the laboratory's destruction, expresses unease about the project's success. The researcher notes that Mewtwo had become too powerful, its psychic abilities strong enough to breach containment fields that should have held it securely. The entry ends mid-sentence, suggesting the destruction began while the scientist was writing. This abrupt conclusion leaves many questions unanswered. Did Mewtwo escape deliberately, or did something trigger a violent outburst? Were there warnings the scientists ignored? The silence that follows that final entry speaks volumes. Mewtwo eventually made its way to Cerulean Cave, a massive cavern system north of Cerulean City that proved inhospitable to most Pokémon. The cave's environmental extremes, temperature fluctuations, unstable terrain, and lack of food sources keep casual explorers away, making it an ideal refuge for a being seeking isolation. Mewtwo remained there for years, only rarely emerging and never engaging with the world outside, except when forced to defend its territory. The creature's story raises ethical questions that the Pokémon world has not fully addressed. If humans possess the technology to create new life, do they bear responsibility for that life's well-being? Mewtwo received no childhood, no guidance, no nurturing. It emerged from a cloning tank, fully formed but mentally unprepared for consciousness. The trauma of that sudden awakening, combined with immediate awareness of its artificial origins, created a being fundamentally damaged by the circumstances of its birth. Johto's legendary Pokémon presents a different relationship between human culture and powerful creatures. Ho-Oh and Lugia, the tower duo, were revered as protectors of the region, with grand structures built in their honor. The Bell Tower and Brass Tower in Ecological City served as sacred sites where the legendary birds would occasionally appear, their presence blessing the city and ensuring prosperity. This symbiotic relationship between humans and legendaries represented an idealized version of coexistence. The destruction of Brass Tower, approximately 150 years before the modern era, marked a turning point in Johto's relationship with its legendary Pokémon. Lightning struck the tower during a storm, igniting a fire that burned for 3 days and nights. 3 unnamed Pokémon perished in the flames, unable to escape the collapsing structure. Ho-Oh appeared as the tower fell, resurrecting the 3 victims with its sacred powers. They emerged transformed. Raikou, embodying the lightning that struck the tower, Entei, representing the fire that consumed it, and Suicune, manifesting the rain that finally extinguished the flames. These 3 legendary beasts scattered across Johto, wandering endlessly and rarely appearing in the same location twice. Their constant movement reflected their nature as reborn beings, creatures who had died and returned, changed, never quite able to settle into ordinary existence again. Trainers who claimed to have encountered them described Pokémon that seemed both present and distant, physically there but mentally elsewhere, as if part of them remained in whatever realm they had visited during death. Ho-Oh's decision to resurrect the 3 Pokémon rather than let them pass peacefully raises questions about the nature of life, death, and rebirth in the Pokémon world. Did the 3 beasts return with their original personalities and memories intact, or were they fundamentally new beings inhabiting familiar forms? If consciousness survives death, only to be altered beyond recognition upon return, can the resurrected truly be called the same individual? These philosophical puzzles emerge naturally from Johto's mythology, but receive no definitive answers. Lugia, Ho-Oh's counterpart, took a different approach to its relationship with humanity. After the Brass Tower's destruction, Lugia retreated to the Whirl Islands, a remote archipelago where powerful ocean currents kept most ships away. The legendary bird chose isolation over continued involvement with human civilization, perhaps viewing the tower's destruction as evidence that humans could not be trusted to maintain sacred sites. Lugia's withdrawal marked a shift from active participation in regional affairs to passive observation from a distance. The contrasting responses of Ho-Oh and Lugia to the same tragedy illustrate different philosophical approaches to the problem of suffering. Ho-Oh responded with an act of creation, resurrecting the dead and transforming tragedy into legend. Lugia responded with withdrawal, removing itself from situations where such tragedies might occur again. Neither approach solved the underlying problem, that the world contains forces beyond anyone's control, forces that can destroy even sacred spaces, but each represented a valid response to that reality. Celebi's role in Johto mythology adds a temporal dimension to the region's legendary landscape. This Pokémon possesses the ability to travel through time, appearing in different eras seemingly at random. Ancient texts describe Celebi as a guardian of forests, a being that appeared when sacred groves faced destruction and vanished once the threat passed. Modern accounts report similar patterns, with Celebi manifesting during ecological disasters and disappearing once balance was restored. The mechanics of Celebi's time travel remain unexplained. Does it move through time the way Pokémon like Doduo move through space, consciously choosing its destination? Or does it exist simultaneously across multiple time periods, its consciousness distributed throughout history? Some researchers theorize that every Celebi sighting throughout history might be the same individual, traveling back and forth across centuries in a pattern only it understands. If true, this would mean the Celebi that blessed ancient shrines thousands of years ago is the same one that occasionally appears in modern Johto forests. This temporal nature gives Celebi a unique perspective that other legendary Pokémon lack. It has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the extinction and emergence of species, the slow transformation of landscapes across geological time. Such comprehensive awareness might explain Celebi's focus on preservation and protection. Having seen what can be lost, it understands the value of what currently exists. The Hoenn region's legendary Pokémon embody primal forces even more directly than those of Kanto or Johto. Kyogre and Groudon represent the eternal conflict between ocean and land, a battle that shaped the planet itself during its formation. Ancient Hoenn myths describe a time when the two titans fought continuously, their struggle causing massive floods and droughts that prevented stable ecosystems from developing. Life existed only in the margins, in the brief periods between catastrophes when conditions temporarily stabilized. Kyogre expanded the oceans with every movement, its mere presence causing rain to fall and sea levels to rise. The Pokémon swam through the depths of the primordial ocean, its passing creating massive waves and underwater currents that carved trenches into the sea floor. Ancient peoples living along Hoenn's coasts learned to recognize the signs of Kyogre's approach: unusual cloud formations, changes in water temperature, and the behavior of marine Pokémon who fled before the Titan's advance. Groudon operated as Kyogre's opposite, expanding land masses and creating mountains with its footsteps. The Pokémon's body temperature burned hot enough to evaporate water instantly, and wherever it walked, steam rose in massive columns that blocked out the sun. Volcanic activity intensified in Groudon's presence, with magma flowing more freely and new volcanic islands emerging from the sea. Ancient texts describe Groudon as a creature of endless hunger, not for food, but for expansion, driven to claim more territory for land at the expense of ocean. The conflict between these two titans could have continued indefinitely, rendering the planet uninhabitable for most life forms. But Rayquaza, dwelling in the ozone layer far above the battlefield, eventually intervened. This third legendary Pokémon possessed the power to calm both Kyogre and Groudon, forcing them into dormancy when their battle threatened to destroy everything. Rayquaza's role as mediator required it to remain vigilant, descending from the sky whenever the balance between land and sea tilted too far in either direction. The details of how Rayquaza achieves this pacification remain unclear. Some texts suggest the Sky Dragon possesses unique energy that counteracts both Kyogre's water and Groudon's fire, a neutral force that can suppress their primal urges. Other accounts describe Rayquaza as simply more powerful than either Titan individually, capable of defeating them through raw strength. A third interpretation treats Rayquaza's intervention as diplomatic rather than forceful, suggesting the Sky Dragon negotiates ceasefires rather than imposing them. Regardless of the method, Rayquaza's interventions allowed Hoenn to develop stable ecosystems. With Kyogre and Groudon dormant, sealed beneath the sea and land respectively, the region's climate moderated. Forests grew, rivers formed permanent courses, and communities could settle without fear of immediate catastrophe. The legendary Pokémon passed from active forces into mythology, remembered but rarely seen. This dormancy lasted for thousands of years, with each generation of Hoenn's inhabitants learning the old stories but never experiencing the reality of legendary Pokémon actively reshaping their world. The Titans became abstract concepts, symbols used in art and literature, but divorced from practical concern. This distance between mythology and daily life led some modern skeptics to question whether Kyogre and Groudon had ever existed at all, or if they were simply exaggerated stories based on natural disasters. The discovery of the orbs changed this skeptical perspective. Two artifacts of immense power, hidden in different locations across Hoenn, proved capable of awakening the dormant Titans. The blue orb resonated with Kyogre's essence, while the red orb connected to Groudon's energy. These objects existed as physical proof that the legends described real beings, not metaphorical forces. But their existence also created danger, as anyone who possessed the orbs could potentially awaken catastrophe. Team Magma and Team Aqua, two extremist organizations with opposing ideological goals, each sought one of the orbs to awaken their preferred titan. Team Magma believed humanity needed more land for expansion and progress, viewing the ocean as wasted space that should be claimed for development. Team Aqua held the opposite position, arguing that human civilization had already claimed too much land and that returning territory to the sea would restore natural balance. Both groups failed to understand that awakening either Kyogre or Groudon would restart a conflict that threatened all life. The organization's leaders, Maxie of Team Magma and Archie of Team Aqua, each believed they could control their awakened titan, using the orbs to direct the legendary Pokemon's power toward their goals. This hubris reflected a common theme in Pokemon lore, the assumption that human intelligence and technology can master forces that predate humanity by millions of years. Both leaders discovered their mistake when their respective titans, once awakened, ignored all attempts at control and resumed their ancient battle. The crisis forced Rayquaza to descend from the ozone layer once again, interrupting its eternal vigil to restore balance below. The Sky Dragon's appearance above Sotopolis City, where Kyogre and Groudon had converged, marked the first time in recorded history that all three weather titans occupied the same space simultaneously. Their combined power warped reality itself, creating weather patterns that should have been impossible and reshaping the landscape on a massive scale. Rayquaza's intervention succeeded in forcing both Kyogre and Groudon back into dormancy, but not before significant damage occurred. Coastal cities experienced flooding, inland areas suffered droughts, and the region's ecosystem underwent stress that would take years to fully recover from. The event served as a reminder that legendary Pokemon operate on scales that make them fundamentally dangerous, regardless of intent. Even if Kyogre and Groudon harbored no malice towards smaller beings, their mere existence and action threatened those beings' survival. The Hoenn crisis also revealed information about mega evolution, a phenomenon that allows certain Pokemon to temporarily access enhanced forms during battle. Rayquaza proved capable of mega evolution without requiring the standard keystones and megastones used by other species, instead drawing power directly from meteorites in the ozone layer. This unique ability suggested that Rayquaza's connection to space and atmosphere gave it access to energy sources unavailable to ground-dwelling Pokemon. The concept of mega evolution itself represents another layer of Pokemon lore that intersects with creation mythology. If Pokemon possess the potential to temporarily access more powerful forms, does that potential exist as part of their original design, or was it added later through natural evolution? Some researchers theorize that mega evolution represents a temporary return to ancient forms, with modern Pokemon briefly accessing the power their ancestors possessed millions of years ago. Others suggest it manifests as a forward evolution, a glimpse of what species might become, given additional time and environmental pressure. Sinnoh's mythology ties more directly into the creation story than any other region, with Mount Coronet serving as a geographical link to the universe's beginning. Ancient temples built on the mountain's slopes and peak-preserved texts describing Arceus's creative acts in detail, unmatched by records from other regions. The people who settled Sinnoh thousands of years ago apparently had direct contact with the creation trio, Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina, and recorded their observations with reverence and precision. Spear Pillar, the temple at Mount Coronet's summit, marks the exact location where the boundaries between dimensions grow thinnest. Here, Under specific celestial alignments, the power of Dialga and Palkia can be felt directly, with time flowing erratically and space distorting in observable ways. Ancient priests who maintained the temple reported experiencing temporal displacement, finding themselves briefly existing in multiple time periods simultaneously, or perceiving locations miles away as if standing directly in them. These phenomena attracted the attention of various groups throughout history, some seeking to understand the universe's fundamental nature and others hoping to exploit dimensional instability for power. Team Galactic, a modern criminal organization, fell into the latter category. Their leader, Cyrus, developed an obsession with creating a new universe, one without emotion, conflict, or imperfection. He believed that by harnessing Dialga and Palkia simultaneously, he could unmake reality and rebuild it according to his specifications. Cyrus's plan required capturing the Lake Guardians, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, and extracting their essence to forge the Red Chain, a mystical restraint capable of binding even legendary Pokémon. The Red Chain existed in legend as an artifact used by ancient peoples to commune with Dialga and Palkia, though historical accounts disagreed on whether it controlled the dragons or merely allowed communication. Cyrus interpreted the legends literally, believing the chain would grant absolute control. The attempt to summon and bind both Dialga and Palkia at Spear Pillar nearly succeeded, with both legendary Pokémon appearing simultaneously and beginning to tear open a portal to what Cyrus called the New World. But the plan failed to account for Giratina, who emerged from the distortion world to drag Cyrus into that realm. Giratina's intervention seemed motivated by a desire to protect the universe's stability rather than any particular opposition to Cyrus's goals. The distortion world exists as a counterbalance to normal space-time, and the creation of a new universe would have disrupted that balance catastrophically. The aftermath of this crisis revealed interesting details about legendary Pokémon psychology and motivation. Dialga and Palkia, despite possessing godlike power, appeared to lack the agency to resist the Red Chain's binding. They responded to commands, mechanically, without apparent distress or rebellion. This suggests that the creation trio, for all their power, might operate more as forces of nature than as individuals with personal desires. They govern time, space, and antimatter not by choice but by nature, unable to act against their fundamental purposes. Giratina, by contrast, demonstrated clear intentionality and decision-making ability. It chose to intervene, chose to drag Cyrus away, and chose to release him eventually after the immediate threat passed. This autonomy suggests that banishment to the distortion world, rather than limiting Giratina, might have freed it from constraints that bind Dialga and Palkia. Removed from the ordered universe, Giratina could develop in ways its siblings could not, gaining something resembling free will. The Lake Guardians, despite being captured and drained of energy to forge the Red Chain, survived the ordeal and returned to their respective lakes. Their resilience demonstrated that even relatively small legendary Pokémon possess durability far exceeding ordinary species. The trauma of captivity and exploitation seemed to leave no lasting damage, with each guardian resuming its ancient vigil as if nothing had occurred. This rapid recovery might reflect their nature as embodiments of mental concepts, knowledge, emotion, and willpower, which cannot be permanently diminished even when temporarily suppressed. Sinnoh's mythology also includes Heatran, a legendary Pokémon that dwells in volcanic chambers deep beneath the region's surface. Unlike the creation trio or lake guardians, Heatran appears to be a singular but natural being, extraordinarily powerful but not tied to fundamental forces of reality. Its body temperature exceeds that of molten magma, and it moves through solid rock as easily as fish swim through water. Ancient peoples who encountered Heatran believed it to be the physical manifestation of volcanic fire, a spirit that could be appeased through ritual offerings. The distinction between Heatran and truly cosmic legendary Pokémon like Dialga highlights a taxonomic challenge that Pokémon researchers face. What criteria determine whether a Pokémon qualifies as legendary? Power alone cannot be the sole factor, as some ordinary Pokémon demonstrate strength exceeding certain legendaries. Rarity explains part of the classification, but not all of it, as some legendary species appear to have multiple individuals. The most satisfying definition treats legendary status as a combination of power, rarity, and cultural significance, creatures that shaped history or mythology in ways ordinary Pokémon did not. Regigigas and its three guardians, Regirock, Registeel, and Regice, occupy an unusual position in Sinnoh's legendary hierarchy. These four Pokémon were not created to govern universal forces, but instead served practical purposes in shaping the physical world. Regigigas pulled continents into their current configuration, while the three smaller Regis assisted with more detailed geographical engineering. Their role as builders rather than rulers makes them less central to creation mythology, but no less important to the world's current form. The temples housing Regirock, Registeel, and Regice scattered across different regions suggest that Regigigas' work spanned the entire planet. Each guardian rests in a different environment. Regirock in desert ruins, Regice in frozen caverns, Registeel in ancient underground chambers, positioned to protect approaches to Snowpoint Temple, where Regigigas sleeps. This distributed defense system implies that whoever designed these temples understood military strategy and anticipated threats to the sleeping giant. The mystery of who built these temples remains unsolved. They predate any known civilization, constructed with engineering techniques that modern scholars cannot fully explain. The stones fit together with precision that suggests advanced tools, yet no tools or remnants of construction camps have been found near the sites. One theory proposes that Regigigas itself built the temples before entering dormancy, creating its own tomb and positioning guardians to ensure it would not be disturbed. Another theory suggests an ancient civilization, now extinct, built the structures as a way to honor or contain the legendary Pokémon. Cresselia and Darkrai represent opposing forces of dreams and nightmares, two Pokémon whose existence highlights the psychological dimensions of legendary power. Cresselia brings peaceful dreams to sleeping beings, its mere presence causing pleasant visions and restful sleep. Darkrai operates as its counterpart, inflicting nightmares so intense that victims often wake screaming or, in extreme cases, remain trapped in nightmare states even while awake. These two legendaries rarely interact directly, each following its own patterns across Sinnoh and beyond. The psychological impact of encountering Darkrai raises questions about the ethics of its existence. If a Pokémon cannot help but cause suffering simply by existing, does it bear moral responsibility for that harm? Darkrai appears to lack conscious control over its nightmare-inducing aura, meaning it causes harm without intent or malice. Some philosophical traditions would absolve Darkrai of blame under such circumstances, while others would argue that consequences matter more than intentions. The Pokémon itself seems to grapple with these questions, often isolating itself to minimize the damage it causes. Cresselia's role as a counter to Darkrai suggests a natural balance in the dream realm, similar to the balance between land and sea, embodied by Gruden and Kyogre. Too many nightmares would drive populations into madness, while too many pleasant dreams might cause beings to reject waking reality in favor of sleep. The two legendary Pokémon maintain equilibrium not through direct interaction, but through their independent activities, each unconsciously limiting the other's influence. The Unova region developed a distinctly different relationship with its legendary Pokémon, focusing on truth, ideals, and the conflict between competing visions of what the world should be. Reshiram and Zekrom, two dragon-type legendaries, were originally a single being that split in response to a conflict between twin heroes. These heroes, founders of the Unova region, held opposing beliefs about whether truth or ideals should guide civilization. Their disagreement grew so intense that the dragons serving them could not maintain unity, splitting into two beings that each embodied one hero's philosophy. Reshiram represents truth, the concept that reality exists independently of perception or desire and must be acknowledged regardless of whether that acknowledgement proves comfortable. This legendary Pokémon burns with white fire that cannot be extinguished by water or smothered by earth, symbolizing how truth persists despite attempts to suppress or deny it. Those who encounter Reshiram report feeling exposed, as if the legendary dragon can perceive their deepest secrets and unspoken motives. Zekrom embodies ideals, the belief that reality should be shaped to match visions of how things ought to be, rather than accepting how things are. The legendary dragon generates electricity capable of powering entire cities, representing the transformative energy of idealism when properly harnessed. Encounters with Zekrom often inspire witnesses to pursue ambitious goals they previously considered impossible, as if the legendary Pokémon's presence validates the pursuit of ideals over pragmatic limitation. The split between Reshiram and Zekrom occurred thousands of years ago, and both dragons entered dormancy after the twin heroes died. They remained hidden until modern times, when their awakening coincided with another conflict between individuals representing truth and ideals. Team Plasma, an organization claiming to seek Pokémon liberation, fractured along similar philosophical lines when its leader's true motives were exposed. The legendary dragons emerged in response to this conflict, drawn by the intensity of opposed convictions. Kyurem, a third legendary dragon dwelling in the giant chasm, represents what remained after Reshiram and Zekrom split from the original dragon. This incomplete being possesses immense power, but lacks the coherence of its counterparts, its body partially frozen and its energy unfocused. Legends suggest that Kyurem seeks to reunite with Reshiram or Zekrom, restoring itself to wholeness, but such reunion might require conditions similar to those that caused the original split. The technology to fuse Kyurem with either Reshiram or Zekrom exists, developed by an ancient civilization whose remnants survive only as ruins scattered across Unova. The DNA splicers, devices capable of temporarily merging the legendary dragons, demonstrate engineering sophistication that modern science struggles to replicate. How did ancient peoples, without access to advanced genetic knowledge, create tools that manipulate legendary Pokémon at a molecular level? The question remains unanswered, but the splicer's existence proves that ancient civilizations possessed capabilities modern ones lack. The concept of fusion between legendary Pokémon introduces complications to creation mythology. If beings can merge and split, do they possess fixed identities, or are they more fluid than traditional definitions of individuality suggest? When Kyurem fuses with Reshiram to become White Kyurem, is the resulting entity a single being, or two beings occupying one body? These philosophical puzzles mirror similar questions raised by Pokémon, like Slowbro, whose evolution involves symbiosis with Shelter, creating a new entity from two previously separate organisms. The Tau trio, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem, connects to Unova's cultural emphasis on competing truths and the difficulty of determining objective reality. The region's history features numerous conflicts where both sides believe themselves absolutely correct, their convictions so strong that compromise became impossible. The legendary dragons serve as warnings about such rigidity, demonstrating how absolute certainty can tear apart even the most powerful unity. Cobalion, Terrakion, Virizion, and Keldeo form the Swords of Justice, a quartet of legendary Pokémon associated with protecting weaker Pokémon from human exploitation. Ancient legends describe a war where humans destroyed a forest, killing countless Pokémon in the process. The three senior members of the quartet appeared during the crisis, defending survivors and eventually driving human forces away. Keldeo joined the group later, training under the three elders to develop the skills necessary to continue their protective mission. The Swords of Justice represent a different kind of legendary Pokémon, beings defined not by cosmic power, but by martial skill and moral purpose. They possess strength exceeding most ordinary Pokémon, but operate within recognizable physical laws, lacking reality warping abilities. Their legendary status derives from their role as protectors, their consistent appearance throughout history whenever Pokémon face organized threats. This consistency suggests either extraordinary longevity or multiple generations of Pokémon taking up the same role, with the title Swords of Justice passed down through succession. The moral clarity of the Swords of Justice, defending the weak, opposing exploitation, contrasts sharply with the more ambiguous motivations of cosmic legendaries like Giratina or even Reshiram and Zekrom. Cobalion and its companions operate according to comprehensible ethical principles, their actions predictable based on those principles. This makes them more approachable than world-shaping entities whose decisions operate on scales too vast for individual comprehension. Unova's mythology also includes Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus, three legendary Pokémon embodying different weather phenomena. These genies, as they're sometimes called, travel in pairs or alone, their presence causing violent storms, tornadoes, and lightning strikes. Ancient peoples feared their arrival, building shrines to appease them and encourage their swift departure. Unlike the Swords of Justice, who intervene deliberately to protect others, the forces of nature trio cause destruction simply by existing, their environmental impact overwhelming local ecosystems. The destructive potential of Tornadus and Thundurus made them targets for ancient attempts at containment or control. Various civilizations developed methods to seal the genies in specially crafted vessels, trapping them until they could be safely released far from populated areas. These containment methods succeeded only temporarily, with the legendaries eventually breaking free and resuming their wandering. Landorus served as a mediator, appearing when Tornadus and Thundurus's combined presence threatened catastrophic damage, calming both and reducing their destructive impact. The relationship between the forces of Nature Trio and Unova's geography influenced settlement patterns, with communities deliberately avoiding areas known for frequent legendary sightings. This caution created wilderness zones where human presence remained minimal, preserving ecosystems that might otherwise have been developed. In this way, even destructive legendary Pokémon contributed to environmental conservation, though not through any conscious intention. Meloetta, a mythical Pokémon associated with music and performance, rarely appears in Unova's historical records, but has been witnessed by enough credible sources to confirm its existence. The Pokémon can shift between two forms, one emphasizing graceful movement and psychic power, the other focused on physical combat and rhythmic precision. Ancient texts describe Meloetta as a muse, inspiring artists and performers to create masterworks that would not otherwise have been possible. The connection between Meloetta and human creativity raises questions about the nature of inspiration. Does genius originate within individuals, or can it be granted by external forces? If Meloetta truly enhances creative ability, does art created under its influence belong to the artist or the Pokémon? These questions have troubled philosophers for centuries, with no consensus emerging. What remains clear is that Meloetta's appearances correlate with periods of extraordinary artistic achievement, suggesting at minimum that the Pokémon's presence encourages creative work, even if it does not directly cause it. The Kalos region's mythology revolves around life, death, and resurrection, with Xerneas and Yveltal representing opposing but interdependent forces. Xerneas embodies life energy, capable of revitalizing barren landscapes and extending the lifespans of living beings. When Xerneas wakes from its dormant tree form, forests bloom, springs emerge from dry ground, and creatures thought extinct reappear in unexplained numbers. The legendary Pokémon radiates vitality so intense that even those not directly touched by its power feel energized and hopeful in its presence. Yveltal represents the opposite extreme, absorbing life energy from everything around it. When this legendary Pokémon awakens, plants wither, animals collapse, and even the land itself seems to age rapidly. Yveltal does not kill through malice but through nature, its existence requiring constant intake of life force to sustain itself. After absorbing sufficient energy, Yveltal returns to dormancy as a cocoon, sleeping for centuries before hunger wakens it again. The cycle of Xerneas awakening to spread life, followed by Yveltal awakening to absorb it, creates a pattern that is repeated throughout Kalos' history. Ancient civilizations tracked this cycle, recording approximate intervals between awakenings and attempting to predict when each legendary would next emerge. These predictions proved imperfect, as the dormancy periods varied unpredictably, sometimes lasting mere decades, and other times stretching across millennia. Zygarde serves as Kalos' third legendary, existing in multiple forms that reflect its role as ecosystem guardian. At its base, Zygarde consists of individual cells and cores scattered across the region, each one monitoring environmental conditions independently. When threats arise, these components can gather together, forming more powerful bodies capable of direct intervention. The smallest form resembles a serpentine creature, while complete fusion produces a towering humanoid whose power rivals Xerneas and Yveltal combined. This modular nature makes Zygarde unique among legendary Pokémon, a being that exists simultaneously as many separate entities and one unified consciousness. The cells function like a distributed nervous system, each one processing local information and contributing to a collective awareness that spans the entire region. This arrangement allows Zygarde to respond to threats anywhere in Kalos almost instantaneously, assembling appropriate force levels for each situation. The environmental monitoring role positions Zygarde as a counterbalance to both Xerneas and Yveltal, preventing either from pushing the ecosystem too far toward life or death. When Xerneas spreads vitality too widely, populations explode and resources become scarce, leading to mass starvation that ultimately kills more than Yveltal's direct absorption would. When Yveltal drains too much life, ecosystems collapse into sterility that takes generations to recover from. Zygarde maintains equilibrium, sometimes suppressing Xerneas' revival energy and other times limiting Yveltal's absorption range. The ultimate weapon of Kalos represents one of history's darkest chapters, a device created during an ancient war that devastated both Pokémon and human populations. The weapon drew power from Pokémon life force, channeling that energy into a beam capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. King AZ, the monarch who commissioned its construction, initially intended it as a tool to end the war quickly, hoping that overwhelming force would compel surrender and save lives overall. The plan failed catastrophically. When the weapon fired, it killed millions of Pokémon and humans instantly, their life energy absorbed to fuel the blast. Among the casualties was Floette, AZ's beloved companion who had died in the war's early stages. Grief-stricken and desperate, AZ reconfigured the weapon to resurrect his lost Pokémon, sacrificing additional lives to restore one. The resurrection succeeded, but Floette, upon learning the cost, rejected AZ and disappeared, unable to forgive the atrocity committed in her name. The weapon's energy pulse transformed AZ himself, extending his lifespan indefinitely and causing him to grow to enormous height. He wandered Kalos for 3,000 years afterward, immortal but alone, searching for the Floette who had left him. This punishment, if it can be called that, reflected the magnitude of his crime. He lived long enough to witness the full consequences of his actions, seeing generation after generation grapple with the trauma his weapon had inflicted. The weapon itself was eventually dismantled, its components scattered to prevent anyone from reassembling it. But the device's influence persisted in unexpected ways. Mega evolution, a phenomenon that allows certain Pokémon to temporarily access enhanced forms, appears to be connected to the energy released during the weapon's firing. Mega Stones, required for most Pokémon to undergo Mega Evolution, concentrate most heavily in areas affected by the weapon's blast radius, suggesting they formed from crystallized life energy released during the catastrophe. This connection between Mega Evolution and ancient atrocity complicates the phenomenon's ethical status. If Mega Evolution power derives from mass death, does using that power honor those deaths or exploit them? Can good emerge from evil origins, or does the source forever taint the outcome? These questions plague researchers who study Mega Evolution, particularly those from Kalos who cannot forget the weapon's history. The process of Mega Evolution itself involves temporarily overriding a Pokémon's natural form, pushing it beyond normal biological limits. Many Pokédex entries describe Mega Evolution as painful or distressing, with some Mega-evolved Pokémon exhibiting behavioral changes that suggest psychological damage. Mega Salamence experiences such intense transformation that its body partially liquefies during the process. Mega Sharpedo develops additional spines that pierce through its own flesh. Mega Tyranitar's increased mass crushes its internal skeleton, forcing it to rely on raw power to continue moving. These disturbing details raise questions about whether Mega Evolution represents progress or regression, whether the power gained justifies the suffering inflicted. Trainers who regularly use Mega Evolution might not witness their Pokémon's pain directly, as most transformations last only briefly, and Pokémon rarely communicate distress in ways humans easily recognize. But Pokédex researchers, studying the phenomenon more carefully, document concerning patterns that suggest Mega Evolution creates genuine harm rather than simply aesthetic discomfort. Not all Mega Evolutions cause obvious suffering. Some Pokémon, like Mega Gardevoir or Mega Altaria, undergo transformations that appear graceful rather than violent, their new forms flowing naturally from their base states. These variations in experience might reflect differences in how well each species adapts to the intense energy surge that Mega Evolution requires. Species whose biology already handles high energy levels might transform smoothly, while those less adapted experience the process more traumatically. The bond between trainer and Pokémon plays a crucial role in mega evolution, with the transformation requiring not just megastones and keystones, but also strong emotional connection. This requirement suggests that mega evolution operates partly through psychological channels rather than purely physical ones. The energy flows through the bond between species, amplified by mutual trust and understanding. Without that foundation, the stones remain inert, no matter how properly they're positioned. Alola's legendary Pokémon reflect the region's emphasis on light, both literal and metaphorical. Solgaleo embodies the sun, its body radiating heat and brightness that can illuminate even the darkest spaces. Ancient Alolans worshipped this legendary as a deity, building temples in its honor and conducting ceremonies timed to solar events. Solgaleo's rare appearances brought prosperity, with harvests improving and illness declining in years when the legendary emerged from its resting place. Lunala represents the moon and night sky, its wings spanning distances that seem impossible for a flying creature. Where Solgaleo brings harsh illumination that exposes everything to view, Lunala provides gentle darkness that allows rest and recovery. Ancient Alolans viewed the two legendaries as complementary rather than opposed, understanding that both light and darkness serve essential purposes in natural cycles. Neither could exist without the other, each defining its counterpart through contrast. The relationship between Solgaleo and Lunala extends beyond simple opposition. Ancient texts describe the two legendaries as parents to Cosmog, a small Pokémon that develops through several stages before eventually becoming either a Solgaleo or a Lunala, depending on environmental factors. This reproductive cycle, if accurately recorded, makes Solgaleo and Lunala unique among legendary Pokémon, most of whom cannot or do not reproduce. The existence of Cosmog proves that legendary status does not necessarily imply uniqueness, as multiple individuals of the same legendary species can coexist across time. Cosmog's development, from nearly helpless infant to powerful legendary, occurs through unusual stages. The initial form, resembling a small nebula, possesses almost no combat ability and relies entirely on caretakers for survival. Evolution into Cosmoem creates a dense cocoon that concentrates the Pokémon's energy, preparing it for final transformation. The choice between Solgaleo and Lunala seems to depend on subtle factors researchers have not fully identified, with some Cosmog evolving towards solar aspects while others develop lunar characteristics. Necrozma, a third legendary Pokémon associated with light, demonstrates what happens when luminous energy becomes corrupted or depleted. This being once radiated brilliance that illuminated entire worlds, but extensive abuse by beings seeking its power drained Necrozma until only a fragment of its original radiance remained. The depleted Pokémon wanders dimensions searching for light sources it can absorb, driven by desperate need to restore what was lost. Necrozma's ability to fuse with either Solgaleo or Lunala creates forms that borrow their light temporarily, allowing brief restoration of Necrozma's original brilliance. These fusions resemble parasitism more than symbiosis, with Necrozma forcibly merging with its host and drawing their energy for its own purposes. The hosts survive the process but emerge weakened, their own light diminished by what Necrozma took. This exploitative relationship positions Necrozma as a tragic figure, a being whose suffering drives it to harm others despite potentially lacking malicious intent. The concept of Ultra Beasts, introduced through Alola's lore, expands Pokémon mythology beyond a single universe. These creatures originate in dimensions called Ultra Space, realities with different physical laws where life evolved along completely alien paths. Ultra Beasts that enter the standard Pokémon world often struggle to survive, their biology poorly adapted to local conditions. Similarly, Pokémon from the standard universe cannot easily survive in ultra-space, making interdimensional travel dangerous for all involved. The Ultra Recon Squad, humans native to one ultra-space dimension, arrived in Alola seeking help against Necrozma, which had drained their world of light and rendered it nearly uninhabitable. Their civilization adapted to darkness, developing technology that allowed survival without natural illumination, but they sought restoration of light rather than permanent adaptation. This situation demonstrated how Necrozma's search for energy caused suffering across multiple dimensions, its desperate need creating cascading crises wherever it appeared. Galar's legendary Pokémon tie deeply into the region's history of conflict and unity. Zacian and Zamazenta, two warrior Pokémon wielding sword and shield respectively, defended Galar during an ancient crisis known as the Darkest Day. A massive Pokémon called Eternatus descended from space, its presence causing Pokémon across the region to Dynamax uncontrollably, growing to enormous sizes and rampaging without awareness of their actions. Zacian and Zamazenta fought Eternatus, eventually defeating it and sealing it beneath the earth. The two heroes then disappeared into myth, leaving behind only legends and occasional sightings by those who ventured into Galar's deepest forests. Their weapons, the rusted sword and rusted shield, survived as artifacts that could summon the heroes if Galar faced existential threat again. These items remained inert for thousands of years, passed between generations who viewed them as historical curiosities rather than functional tools, until Eternatus's reawakening forced their activation. Eternatus's true nature as an alien being introduces questions about whether creatures from other worlds should be classified as Pokémon at all, or if that term applies only to life native to the planet. The entity absorbs energy from its surroundings constantly, using that power to fuel its own existence and generate the Dynamax phenomenon. Galar's abundance of power spots, locations where Dynamax energy concentrates, all trace back to Eternatus's presence beneath the earth, its sealed body still leaking enough energy to affect the surface above. The Darkest Day event itself occurred approximately 3,000 years before the modern era, marking one of the most catastrophic events in Galar's recorded history. Accounts describe the sky turning black as Eternatus emerged, with massive Pokémon appearing across the region and attacking settlements without provocation. The crisis united Galar's previously feuding tribes, forcing cooperation that eventually led to the region's political unification. In this way, Eternatus inadvertently created the peaceful Galar that exists in modern times, though not through any benevolent intention. Calyrex, an ancient king who ruled Galar in prehistory, represents a different kind of legendary Pokémon, one whose power derives from cultivation and cooperation rather than raw strength. This psychic and grass-type ruler helped Galar's agriculture flourish, ensuring bountiful harvests and protecting communities from natural disasters. Ancient peoples revered Calyrex as both leader and deity, constructing statues and shrines in its honor across the region. Over time, as human civilization grew more independent and less reliant on Calyrex's direct assistance, worship of the king faded. Fewer offerings were made, fewer prayers spoken, and eventually Calyrex's very existence passed into legend that most modern Galarians dismiss as myth. This decline in faith weakened Calyrex considerably, suggesting that legendary Pokémon associated with kingship or divinity might draw power from belief itself, growing stronger when worshipped and weaker when forgotten. Calyrex's relationship with two steeds, Glastrier and Spectrier, adds another dimension to its mythology. These two horse Pokemon represent opposing elemental forces, ice and shadow, and serve as mounts that amplify Calyrex's power when ridden. Ancient texts describe Calyrex switching between steeds depending on what challenges the region faced, riding Glastrier to combat droughts and fires, mounting Spectrier to ward off plague and invasion. The choice of steed transformed Calyrex's abilities and appearance, demonstrating how legendary Pokemon can adapt their forms to meet changing needs. The Crown Tundra, Galar's frozen southernmost region, houses temples and ruins dating back to Calyrex's reign. Explorers who venture into these ancient sites sometimes report encountering ghostly visions of the past, glimpses of a time when Calyrex walked openly among its subjects rather than hiding in legend. These experiences might represent psychic echoes left by Calyrex itself, memories impressed into the land so strongly that they persist millennia after the events they depict. Regieleki and Regidrago join the Regi family in Galar, two additional guardians created by Regigigas to serve purposes distinct from Regirock, Registeel, and Regis. Regieleki embodies pure electrical energy contained within an insulating shell, its power so intense that ancient peoples feared releasing it might cause catastrophic environmental damage. Regidrago consists of crystallized dragon energy shaped into an incomplete form, its creator apparently running out of materials before completing the body, leaving only a head and minimal limbs. These two Regis were sealed in separate temples deep within the Crown Tundra, their power deemed too dangerous for regular deployment. The seals require solving complex puzzles that test both intelligence and physical ability, ensuring that only as determined explorers with proper training could access the chambers. This extra security layer reflects ancient people's recognition that some forces, even when technically controllable, should remain locked away except in dire emergency. The Galarian Star Tournament represents modern Galar's celebration of its legendary heritage, bringing together powerful trainers who battle using strategies inspired by ancient heroes. While primarily a sporting event, the tournament maintains ceremonial elements that honor Zacian and Zamazenta, ensuring newer generations learn the stories of how their heroes sacrificed themselves to save the region. This cultural continuity keeps the legendary Pokémon relevant even as society grows more secular and less dependent on myths. Hisui, the ancient name for what would become Sinnoh, provides glimpses into how legendary Pokémon interacted with early human settlements. The region's peoples developed vastly different relationships with Pokémon than later generations would, viewing them as dangerous forces to be respected and avoided rather than partners to be caught and trained. This cautious approach reflected genuine environmental hazards, with aggressive Pokémon dominating territories and rarely tolerating human presence peacefully. Dialga and Palkia's appearances in Hisui occurred more frequently than in modern Sinnoh, with the ancient records describing multiple sightings per century rather than one every few millennia. These appearances correlated with natural disasters, suggesting the creation duo emerged in response to disturbances in time and space rather than following predictable schedules. Early Hisuians learned to recognize warning signs, temporal anomalies, spatial distortions, unusual Pokémon behavior that preceded legendary manifestations. The worship of Sinnoh, a name that eventually replaced Hisui, began as acknowledgement of the region's legendary Pokémon rather than religious devotion in a traditional sense. Early settlers recognized they shared their land with beings far more powerful than themselves and adapted their behavior accordingly. Temples served as much as warning systems and safe zones as places of worship, designed to provide shelter when legendary Pokémon appeared and devastation followed. Arceus's direct involvement in Hisui's history represents the only confirmed case of the original one manifesting physically rather than acting through intermediaries. The deity emerged in response to a space-time rift that threatened to tear reality apart, tasking a time-displaced trainer with gathering fragments of itself scattered across the region. This quest required confronting each of the region's noble Pokémon, powerful individuals driven to unusual aggression by the rift's influence. The noble Pokémon themselves occupy an interesting position in Hisui's social structure. These individuals, while not technically legendary, received reverence from the clans who viewed them as guardians and leaders. Cleaver, Lilligant, Arcanine, Electrode, and Avalugg each served a specific clan, protecting its members and helping manage resources within their territory. The relationship between nobles and clans resembled feudal arrangements, with the Pokémon providing security in exchange for offerings and worship. The phenomenon that drove noble Pokémon to frenzy, exposure to space-time distortion energy, provided early evidence that reality itself was becoming unstable in Hisui. Objects and Pokémon from different time periods began appearing randomly across the region, torn from their proper moments and deposited into an era where they did not belong. These displaced elements, both from the distant past and far future, created chaos as beings encountered anachronisms they lacked context to understand. Origin forms of Dialga and Palkia, revealed through ancient texts and carvings found in Hisui's ruins, depict the creation duo with different bodies than their modern appearances suggest. These origin forms more closely resemble primordial beings, their shapes flowing and incomplete, as if they had not yet fully settled into fixed physical states. The difference between origin and modern forms raises questions about whether legendary Pokémon evolve over time, their bodies gradually solidifying as they age, or whether they can shift between multiple forms depending on circumstances. The Celestica ruins scattered across Hisui preserve records from a civilization that predated known history, a people who apparently achieved advanced understanding of space-time mechanics before vanishing completely. Their architectural style resembles nothing found in later Sinnoh cultures, and their written language remained undeciphered until modern archaeological breakthroughs provided translation keys. What these ancient people learned about reality and why they disappeared remain active research questions. Mount Coronet in Hisui served the same role. It would play thousands of years later in modern Sinnoh, functioning as a nexus where dimensional boundaries weakened and legendary Pokémon could more easily manifest. The mountain's unique geology, with caves and tunnels creating natural resonance chambers, amplified any disturbances in space-time until they became impossible to ignore. Early Hisuians avoided the mountain's interior except during carefully planned expeditions, recognizing that venturing too deep risked encounters with forces beyond human comprehension. Giratina's involvement in Hisui's space-time crisis demonstrated that the banished dragon maintained awareness of events in the regular universe despite its exile. When reality began fracturing, Giratina emerged from the distortion world not to attack, but to assist, its unique nature allowing it to stabilize rifts that neither Dialga nor Palkia could address effectively. This cooperation between the three creation dragons, unprecedented in recorded history, proved essential to preventing total collapse. The question of why Giratina chose to help rather than exploit the chaos for its own purposes remains debated among scholars. Some suggest the dragon acted from genuine concern for reality's preservation, recognizing that its own realm would be affected if the regular universe destabilized completely. Others propose Giratina saw an opportunity to prove its worth, hoping that assistance during crisis might eventually lead to its exile being lifted. A third interpretation frames Giratina's actions as purely instinctive, a being governing antimatter responding automatically to threats against matter-antimatter balance. Paldea's legendary Pokémon connect directly to the region's ancient history, with Koraidon and Miraidon representing paradoxes that should not exist according to conventional understanding of time. These two creatures appear to be Pokémon from different eras, one from the distant past, one from the far future, brought into these present through mechanisms not fully understood. Their presence raises fundamental questions about temporal mechanics and whether time travel creates alternate timelines or simply relocates beings within a single timeline. The Area Zero crater at Paldea's center serves as a focal point for temporal anomalies, with the region's deepest point showing signs of exposure to energy sources that defy conventional analysis. Terrastall phenomena originating from the crater's depths allow Pokémon to temporarily assume crystalline forms that enhance their abilities, but the mechanism producing this effect remains mysterious even to researchers who have studied it extensively. Terapagos, a small turtle-like Pokémon dwelling in Area Zero's lowest levels, appears to be the source of terrestrial energy. This being exists in multiple forms, with its true appearance only revealed when it accumulates enough energy to transform into what researchers call stellar form. In this state, Terapagos resembles a small planet or star, radiating energy that can fundamentally alter the nature of nearby Pokémon. The Great Crater of Paldea formed approximately 1 million years ago, carved into the earth by unknown forces that left the landscape scarred in ways erosion has not yet erased. Ancient peoples who explored the crater's depths reported seeing impossible things, visions of the past and future, creatures that should not exist, landscapes that shifted without reason. These accounts, once dismissed as exaggeration or hallucination, gained credibility after modern exploration confirmed temporal instability throughout Area Zero. Heath's expedition into Area Zero several hundred years ago produced the Scarlet Book and Violet Book, contradictory accounts that describe entirely different creatures dwelling in the crater. The Scarlet Book depicts ancient Pokémon with primitive features and savage dispositions, while the Violet Book shows futuristic mechanical beings with capabilities far exceeding modern technology. For centuries, scholars debated which account was accurate, assuming one explorer must have fabricated their findings. Recent discoveries prove both books truthful, with the Area Zero containing creatures from multiple time periods simultaneously. The paradox Pokémon that emerge from Area Zero's depths challenge fundamental assumptions about how time functions. These beings exist as living contradictions, creatures whose presence in the current era should create causal paradoxes, yet apparently does not. Iron Bundle appears to be a future evolution of Delibird modified with mechanical components, while Great Tusk resembles an ancient ancestor of Donphan with exaggerated features suited to prehistoric environments. Both coexist in the same location, despite originating from eras separated by millions of years. Professor Sada in Pokémon Scarlet and Professor Turo in Pokémon Violet each pursued different visions for Paldea's future based on their explorations of Area Zero. Sada became obsessed with ancient Pokémon and sought to restore prehistoric ecosystems, believing modern species had grown weak and that returning to a more primitive state would benefit everyone. Turo focused on future Pokémon and advanced technology, convinced that progress toward a more mechanical, efficient world represented the proper path. Both professors constructed time machines intended to bring their preferred era's Pokémon into the present, succeeding only in creating tragedy. The machines functioned, but not in ways their creators intended or controlled. Koraidon and Miraidon emerged as unintended consequences, beings neither fully ancient nor completely futuristic, but something in between. The professors died in separate accidents related to their research, leaving behind AI duplicates programmed to continue their work. These AI copies, more advanced than any other artificial intelligence in the Pokémon world, possess enough independence to question their programming and eventually decide to deactivate the time machines permanently. This decision, made by machines emulating dead humans, raises profound questions about consciousness, free will, and what constitutes true life. If an AI can make moral choices that contradict its original programming, does it possess the same kind of agency that living beings have? The ethics of using time machines to draw Pokémon from other eras into the present complicate Paldea's relationship with its legendary creatures. Taking beings from their proper time periods potentially disrupts those eras, creating absences that might alter history in unknowable ways. Even if the changes remain small enough to avoid paradoxes, the Act still treats time as a resource to be exploited rather than a dimension to be respected. Paldea Academy, the region's premier educational institution, became centrally involved in Area Zero research after the professors' deaths. Students and faculty worked together to document paradox Pokémon, study terrestrial phenomena, and attempt to understand the crater's temporal properties. This academic involvement helped legitimize research that earlier generations had dismissed as too dangerous or too theoretical to merit serious attention. The Treasures of Ruin Quartet, Wo-Chien, Chien-Pao, Ting-Lu, and Chi-Yu represent another layer of Paldean legend, beings formed from cursed objects that absorb centuries of negative human emotions. These 4 Pokémon emerged when greed, hatred, envy, and malice concentrated in wooden tablets, a ceremonial sword, a bronze vessel, and prayer beads, respectively. The object's transformations into living creatures demonstrates how intense emotion can affect even inanimate matter in the Pokémon world. Ancient Paldean texts describe the Treasures of Ruin as divine punishments, consequences for a king whose greed and cruelty poisoned the land itself. The monarch accumulated wealth while his people starved, hoarding treasures that served no purpose beyond display. When merchants from distant lands brought the 4 objects as tribute, they appeared benign, simple items of cultural significance. But the king's corruption infected them, warping their nature until they became vessels for accumulated suffering. The transformation occurred gradually, with the objects slowly gaining awareness over decades or centuries. Wo-Chien formed from tablets recording oppressive laws, absorbing the resentment of those unjustly punished. Chien-Pao crystallized from a sword used in betrayals, soaking up hatred between former allies. Ting-Lu emerged from a vessel used in ceremonies honoring the greedy king, concentrating envy and desire. Chi-Yu ignited within beads, worn during prayers that went unanswered, burning with rage at perceived divine abandonment. Once fully awakened, the 4 treasures rampaged across Paldea, their presence causing crops to fail, water sources to dry up, and previously peaceful Pokémon to turn violent. The destruction continued until powerful trainers managed to seal each treasure in separate shrines scattered across the region. These seals required constant maintenance, with families dedicating themselves across generations to ensuring the treasures remained contained. Modern Paldean society largely forgot the Treasures of Ruin, with shrine maintenance becoming ceremonial rather than practically necessary. Most citizens viewed the old stories as myths, entertaining but not literally true. This skepticism ended when the seals weakened due to neglect, and 3 of the 4 treasures escaped simultaneously, resuming their destructive patterns after centuries of imprisonment. The re-emergence of cursed Pokémon in the modern era forced Paldean society to confront questions about responsibility and memory. When dangerous beings get sealed away, does each generation bear obligation to remember why, or can the past eventually be safely forgotten? The treasures of ruin prove that some threats do not diminish with time, remaining as dangerous after centuries of containment as they were at initial sealing. Differences between regional forms of the same species suggest that legendary Pokémon and environmental pressures interact in ways that produce divergent evolution even among creatures sharing common ancestry. Alolan forms of Kanto Pokémon like Vulpix and Marowak developed ice and fire ghost typings, respectively, adaptations to Alola's unique climate and spiritual landscape. These variations occur over relatively short time frames by evolutionary standards, suggesting that Pokémon possess unusual genetic plasticity. Galarian forms show even more dramatic changes, with Pokémon like Ponyta gaining psychic and fairy typings completely absent from their Cantonian counterparts. The explanation for such rapid diversification remains debated, with some researchers proposing that legendary Pokémon actively shape local species to fill needed ecological niches. Under this theory, regional guardian legendaries like Tapu Koko or Tapu Lele might influence evolution through proximity, their power slowly altering nearby Pokémon over generations. Hisuian forms provide evidence for this theory, as many species in ancient Sinnoh displayed different types and abilities than their modern descendants. Growlithe gained rock typing in Hisui, adapting to volcanic regions where fire alone proved insufficient. Zorua and Zoroark developed normal and ghost typing as camouflage against the hostile environment, allowing them to blend into snow-covered terrain while simultaneously becoming spectral hunters. These adaptations occurred relatively quickly in geological terms, far faster than Darwinian evolution typically operates. The rapid appearance and disappearance of regional forms as human settlement patterns change suggests environment affects Pokémon evolution more strongly than genetics alone would predict. A species transplanted to a new region can develop regional characteristics within a few generations, while populations that remain in their original territory maintain their ancestral forms indefinitely. This environmental sensitivity might explain how legendary Pokémon, by shaping regional characteristics, indirectly influence the species that live within their spheres of influence. Type diversity across regions creates ecosystems where dramatically different Pokémon fill similar ecological roles. Pidgey in Kanto, Tylo in Hoenn, Starly in Sinnoh, and Rookidee in Galar all serve as early root bird Pokémon, yet each developed distinct typings and abilities suited to local conditions. This convergent evolution suggests that certain ecological niches remain stable across regions even when legendary Pokémon differ significantly in their natures and powers. The existence of multiple creation myths across different regions raises questions about whether Arceus created all regions simultaneously or sequentially. If sequential, did early regions develop first, with legendary Pokémon like Kyogre and Groudon shaping primordial Earth before Arceus moved on to create other regions? Or did Arceus establish all landmasses at once, delegating specific legendary Pokémon to each region while maintaining ultimate oversight? Ancient texts provide no clear answers, with each region's mythology treating local creation as the primary or only creation event. Legendary trios and duos occurring across multiple regions suggest either that Arceus followed templates when creating regional guardians, or that certain forces naturally organize themselves into opposing pairs or balanced triplets. The prevalence of these patterns, the weather trio in Hoenn, the creation trio in Sinnoh, the light duo in Alola, the hero duo in Galar, implies underlying mathematical or metaphysical principles that Arceus either chose to follow or could not avoid. Some researchers have proposed that Arceus itself might be merely one of multiple creator beings, each responsible for different regions or dimensions. This polytheistic interpretation challenges orthodox mythology, but accounts for contradictions in how different regions describe universal creation. If Arceus created Sinnoh specifically, while other beings shaped other regions, it would explain why Sinnoh's mythology treats Arceus as absolute, while other regions barely mention it. The alternate theory that Arceus created everything but allowed regional variation in how that creation unfolded preserves monotheistic tradition while acknowledging diversity. Under this interpretation, Arceus established universal laws: time, space, matter, antimatter, but permitted legendary Pokémon like Kyogre, Groudon, and others to shape specific regions according to local needs. This delegation of authority explains both Arceus' supreme position and the independence legendary Pokémon display in their own territories. Ultra Space's existence as parallel dimensions, completely separate from the main Pokémon universe, suggests that Arceus' creative power might have limits, or that other forces created these alternate realities. If Arceus shaped all existence, it presumably also created Ultra Space and the beings dwelling there. But if Arceus did not create those dimensions, then either something else did, or they emerged spontaneously through processes not requiring divine intervention. The possibility of spontaneous universe generation challenges religious interpretations of Pokémon mythology while providing scientific frameworks for understanding reality. If universes can arise naturally, given proper conditions, then Arceus might be one powerful being among many rather than the singular source of all existence. This interpretation disturbs those who prefer clear hierarchies and definitive answers, but it aligns with observable evidence of multiple dimensions existing independently. Religious traditions across Pokémon regions adapted to these complexities in different ways. Sinnoh maintained strict devotion to Arceus as supreme creator, viewing other legendary Pokémon as servants rather than independent powers. Johto developed dualistic traditions, recognizing Ho-Oh and Lugia as complementary forces of roughly equal standing. Alola's island guardians received worship as local deities without broader cosmological significance, each tapu governing its island independently. These varied religious approaches demonstrate how mythology serves social functions beyond simply explaining natural phenomena. Sinnoh's unified worship of Arceus reinforced regional unity by providing a shared belief system. Johto's dualism reflected the region's historical experience of conflict and reconciliation between opposing factions. Alola's decentralized guardian system matched its fragmented island geography, with each island developing distinct cultural identity under its tapu's influence. The decline of traditional worship in modern Pokémon regions reflects broader social changes as scientific understanding of legendary Pokémon increases. When beings once considered gods can be studied, cataloged, and occasionally caught by sufficiently skilled trainers, their divine status becomes harder to maintain. Some scholars argue this demystification diminishes legendary Pokémon's cultural importance, while others contend that understanding creatures better increases genuine appreciation for their remarkable abilities. Legendary Pokémon's responses to reduced worship vary by individual and species. Calyrex demonstrably weakened as Galar's population stopped honoring it, suggesting some legendaries draw power from belief or collective attention. Others, like the creation trio, appear unaffected by human opinion, their power deriving from cosmic roles rather than faith. This inconsistency implies that legendary Pokémon encompasses multiple categories of beings with different relationships to humanity. The role of legendary Pokémon in maintaining ecological balance extends beyond their immediate territories. Migration patterns, weather systems, and even geological processes receive influence from legendary activities occurring far from where effects manifest. When Kyogre stirs in its undersea sleep, ocean currents shift globally, affecting marine populations thousands of miles away. When Groudon's temperature rises while dormant, volcanic activity intensifies across multiple regions, even when the Titan remains sealed. These far-reaching effects position legendary Pokémon as integral components of planetary systems rather than isolated, powerful individuals. Removing or killing a legendary, if such were even possible, would likely trigger cascading ecological failures as the forces that being governed fell into chaos. This interconnectedness provides strong evolutionary pressure toward coexistence, as even humans who might wish to eliminate dangerous legendaries ultimately benefit from their stabilizing influence. The question of whether legendary Pokémon can die naturally remains largely unanswered. No confirmed cases of legendary death from aging exist in historical records, though legends describe some being killed in battle or sealed away permanently. The 3 Pokémon who died in Ecrotique's Brass Tower fire were apparently ordinary species later resurrected as legendaries, not beings who began life with legendary status. This suggests legendary Pokémon might possess effective immortality, their consciousness persisting indefinitely unless destroyed through violence or accident. If legendary Pokémon cannot die from age, their perspective on time differs fundamentally from mortal species' understanding. A being that witnesses centuries pass might view individual human generations as fleeting moments, struggles that seem momentous to participants appearing as minor incidents in a much longer story. This temporal disconnect could explain why legendary Pokémon sometimes respond slowly to crises that demand immediate action from mortal perspectives. What seems urgent to humans might not register as truly time-sensitive to beings measuring duration in millennia. Conversely, some legendary Pokémon demonstrate remarkable concern for individual mortal lives, despite the vast gulf in lifespan and power. The Lake Guardians particularly show interest in human welfare, occasionally emerging from their lakes to help lost travelers or warn communities of approaching danger. This compassion, if it can be called that, suggests legendary Pokémon do not universally adopt detached perspectives, but can develop genuine emotional investment in beings they vastly outlive. The formation of bonds between legendary Pokémon and human trainers represents one of the most philosophically interesting aspects of Pokémon mythology. That beings capable of reshaping reality would accept guidance from short-lived mortals seems paradoxical, yet documented cases exist throughout history of legendary Pokémon choosing to travel with specific trainers. The criteria by which legendaries select partners remain unclear, with chosen trainers displaying widely varying personalities, abilities, and moral character. One theory suggests legendary Pokémon sense potential rather than current ability, recognizing in certain individuals capacity for growth that merits investment. Under this interpretation, a legendary choosing to partner with a trainer might be less about the trainer's present strength than their future importance, with the legendary essentially betting on outcomes only it can perceive. This future sight model aligns with observations that trainers chosen by legendaries often go on to accomplish historically significant deeds, though whether the legendary's presence causes that significance or merely recognizes it remains debatable. Alternative explanations frame legendary Pokemon's willingness to partner as loneliness rather than strategic calculation. Beings that exist for millennia, potentially watching countless mortal friends age and die, might desperately crave connection despite knowing each relationship carries a guaranteed heartbreak. A legendary accepting partnership with a trainer would then represent not cold assessment of value, but warm hope that this relationship might prove meaningful despite its inevitable end. The mechanics of catching legendary Pokemon in Pokeballs presents logical challenges that no fully satisfying explanation resolves. If beings possess the power to reshape reality, why can they be contained in devices designed for ordinary species? One interpretation holds that legendary Pokemon allow themselves to be caught, their submission to capture representing a choice rather than constraint. The Pokeball serves as a symbolic contract in this view, a physical representation of mutual agreement rather than actual imprisonment. This contractual interpretation explains why some legendary Pokemon can be caught repeatedly across different save files and playthroughs without contradicting their unique status in the world's mythology. Each instance represents a different legendary choosing to partner with a different trainer in a different timeline or universe. The legendary species exists across all timelines simultaneously, its consciousness distributed such that it can form individual relationships with countless trainers without those relationships conflicting. Alternatively, caught legendary Pokemon might represent only fragments of the true being, with the complete entity remaining free while allowing portions of itself to travel with trainers. Zygarde provides a model for this interpretation, existing simultaneously as cells scattered across Kalos and as unified forms assembled when needed. Other legendary Pokemon might operate similarly, their appearances in Pokeballs being aspects or avatars rather than complete beings. The question of what happens when legendary Pokemon enter Pokeballs connects to broader mysteries about how the devices function. Pokemon converted to energy during capture apparently remain conscious, as they can choose to emerge from balls when called. If legendary Pokemon maintain awareness while captured, they presumably could escape whenever they wished, returning their restraint to pure choice. That they generally do not escape suggests genuine partnership rather than imprisonment. Regional variants of legendary Pokemon add another layer of complexity to questions of uniqueness and identity. The Galarian forms of legendary birds from Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres demonstrate abilities and typings completely distinct from their Cantonian counterparts while sharing names and general body plans. This suggests either parallel evolution produced similar-looking species or a single species diversified regionally while maintaining core characteristics. The Skalmokas. Galarian birds' historical record shows them appearing in Galar independently of any Cantonian connection, implying they might not be variants at all, but entirely separate species that coincidentally resemble Kanto's trio. If true, this raises questions about whether legendary names like Articuno refer to specific individuals or represent titles that multiple beings across regions can claim. Does the name describe a unique entity or a role that different Pokemon can fill in different contexts? The concept of legendary roles rather than legendary individuals offers elegant solutions to many mythological contradictions. Multiple Articuno sightings across different regions would not conflict if Articuno describes any sufficiently powerful ice-type bird achieving certain thresholds of power and wisdom rather than naming one specific creature. This role-based interpretation frames legendary status as something earned or achieved rather than inherent, with the individuals rising to legendary rank through extraordinary development. If legendary status can be achieved rather than only being innate, it implies other Pokémon might possess potential to reach similar heights given proper conditions and time. A Dragonite that lives centuries and develops sufficient power might eventually achieve status comparable to legendary dragons like Rayquaza or Zekrom. This evolutionary possibility would blur lines between legendary and non-legendary Pokémon, treating the distinction as graduated spectrum rather than absolute binary. Evidence for achievable legendary status appears in cases like Lucario's depiction in historical texts as a legendary protector of ancient kingdoms. While modern Lucario appear relatively commonly, ancient accounts describe individual Lucario displaying power and wisdom exceeding normal members of their species. These exceptional individuals earned legendary designation through extraordinary achievement rather than simply through species membership. The relationship between legendary Pokémon and ordinary species in the same evolutionary family further complicates classification schemes. Cosmog evolves into Solgaleo or Lunala, transforming from a helpless infant into a deity-level being through standard evolution. If legendary power can be reached through normal development, it suggests most Pokémon possess latent legendary potential that environmental limitations prevent from manifesting. This latent potential model explains why some regions produce more legendary Pokémon than others, not because Arceus granted those regions special status, but because local conditions allow Pokémon to develop extraordinary power more frequently. Regions with abundant resources, stable environments, and minimal human interference might see more Pokémon reaching legendary development stages, while harsh or heavily populated regions suppress that potential through environmental stress. The concept of resource-limited legendary development has profound implications for conservation ethics in the Pokémon world. If environmental degradation prevents Pokémon from achieving their full potential, human activity directly reduces the universe's legendary Pokémon population. Each forest cleared, each river polluted, each ecosystem disrupted might prevent future legendary Pokémon from emerging, impoverishing reality in ways that cannot be easily quantified. Some philosophers argue that this resource limitation does not apply to truly cosmic legendary Pokémon like Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia, whose power derives from roles in universal structure rather than environmental development. These beings would exist regardless of planetary conditions, their status as fundamental forces making them independent of local ecology. But regional guardians and lesser legendaries might depend heavily on environmental support, their legendary nature emerging from optimal development rather than cosmic mandate. The distinction between cosmic and regional legendary Pokémon maps roughly onto religious categories of supreme deities versus minor gods or spirits. Cosmic legendaries occupy positions analogous to monotheistic gods, singular, omnipotent, foundational. Regional legendaries function more like polytheistic deities, powerful but limited, numerous but not infinite, accessible but not supreme. This hierarchy provides framework for understanding how legendary Pokémon relate to each other and to ordinary species. Worship practices varied accordingly, with cosmic legendaries receiving reverence appropriate to supreme beings, while regional legendaries enjoyed more casual, personal relationships with human populations. Offering food to island guardians in Alola resembles friendship more than submission, a mutually beneficial exchange between beings who share territory. Prayers to Arceus involve formal ceremony and sacred spaces, acknowledging distance between supplicant and deity that does not exist in relationships with accessible regional guardians. The accessibility of regional legendary Pokémon has declined as human populations grew and technology advanced. Ancient peoples encountered legendary Pokémon regularly, their small numbers and limited territorial spread meaning legendary territories remained largely wild. Modern civilization's expansion into every available region leaves legendary Pokémon fewer places to appear openly without human interference. This habitat loss drives legendary Pokémon into remote areas, mountain peaks, deep oceans, dense forests, where human activity remains minimal. Some legendary Pokémon adapted to human presence rather than fleeing it, establishing territories in urban or agricultural areas and finding ecological niches within modified landscapes. These adapted legendaries demonstrate remarkable flexibility, their power allowing them to thrive in conditions that challenge ordinary species. Urban legendary Pokémon, like certain Tapu or Lake Guardians, navigate human society carefully, appearing when needed, but avoiding confrontation when possible. The ethics of human expansion into legendary territories raises questions similar to those surrounding endangered species habitat loss, but complicated by legendary Pokémon's immense power. Unlike ordinary animals that can be relocated or whose habitats can be preserved through designation of protected areas, legendary Pokémon cannot be easily moved and might resist conservation efforts they view as imprisonment. Balancing human development needs against legendary Pokémon territorial requirements becomes a political issue as much as ecological one. Some regions address this balance through sacred zone systems, designating areas as inviolate legendary territory where human activity remained prohibited. These zones typically surrounded known legendary habitats, lakes, mountains, forests that held cultural and ecological significance. Modern enforcement of sacred zones varies significantly, with some regions treating restrictions as serious legal mandates, while others allow them to erode through gradual encroachment. The question of whether legendary Pokémon should receive legal protections under endangered species laws sparked debate in regions where such legislation exists. Some argue legendary Pokémon's power makes them inherently non-endangered, capable of defending themselves from any threat humans might pose. Others contend that protection should focus on preserving habitats and respecting territories rather than preventing direct harm, recognizing that legendary Pokémon need space more than physical security. Legal frameworks protecting legendary Pokémon vary dramatically across regions, reflecting different cultural values and historical experiences. Sinnoh's laws treat legendary Pokémon as sacred beings whose territories automatically receive protected status, with violations carrying severe criminal penalties. This legal tradition emerged from Sinnoh's deep religious connection to Arceus and the Creation Trio, making disrespect toward legendary Pokémon equivalent to blasphemy in addition to environmental crime. Hoenn's approach focuses more on preventing awakening of dormant legendary Pokémon than on protecting active ones. Laws strictly regulate access to seafloor caverns where Kyogre sleeps and volcanic chambers housing Groudon, treating these sites as potential catastrophe zones rather than merely ecological preserves. The memory of how Team Magma and Team Aqua nearly destroyed the region motivates ongoing vigilance, with monitoring systems detecting unauthorized approach to legendary resting places. Unova developed comprehensive legendary rights legislation after the Team Plasma crisis, demonstrated how vulnerable even powerful beings could be to organized exploitation. The laws prohibit using technology to forcibly summon legendary Pokémon, restrict research that might disturb their habitats, and establish protocols for human legendary interactions that minimize stress to both parties. Enforcement remains challenging, as detecting violations often requires admitting that illegal contact occurred in the first place. Alola's legal system integrates legendary Pokémon as recognized entities with standing comparable to human citizens in specific contexts. The Island Guardians receive consultation on major development projects affecting their islands, with Tapu opinions carrying weight in environmental impact assessments. This unusual legal status reflects Alola's view of legendary Pokémon as partners in governance rather than mere wildlife requiring protection from human activity. The question of whether legendary Pokémon can or should be caught for competitive battling generates heated ethical debate. Some tournaments ban legendary Pokémon entirely, arguing their power creates unfair advantages that undermine competitive integrity. Others allow legendaries, but restrict them to special tiers where only equally powerful Pokémon compete. Still others impose no restrictions, contending that if trainers can form genuine bonds with legendary Pokémon, those partnerships deserve recognition in competitive contexts. Practical considerations support legendary restrictions beyond simple fairness concerns. Battles between legendary Pokémon can cause massive collateral damage, with attacks powerful enough to alter local geography or weather patterns. Stadium infrastructure designed for ordinary Pokémon battles cannot reliably contain legendary combat, putting spectators and nearby communities at risk. These safety concerns justify restrictions even when philosophical arguments about fairness remain unsettled. Some legendary Pokémon demonstrate interest in competitive battling, despite the risks and controversies involved. Latios and Latias, the Eon duo from Hoenn, have been observed participating in unofficial battles, apparently for their own enjoyment rather than at trainer direction. These voluntary engagements suggest legendary Pokémon might appreciate competitive challenges as enrichment, opportunities to test their abilities against worthy opponents in controlled settings. The psychological needs of legendary Pokémon remain poorly understood, with most research focusing on their powers and behaviors rather than their emotional or intellectual requirements. Beings that live for millennia presumably experience boredom, loneliness, and desire for stimulation like other intelligent creatures. Whether battling, exploring, or interacting with humans helps meet these needs, or simply distracts from existential emptiness that cannot be truly addressed, remains unknown. Legendary Pokémon that form bonds with human trainers often outlive their partners by centuries or millennia, accumulating losses that might become psychologically unbearable over time. A legendary that befriends a 10-year-old trainer must eventually watch that friend age, weaken, and die while the legendary itself remains unchanged. Repeating this experience across generations could build grief so massive that continued engagement with mortals becomes too painful to sustain. This accumulated grief might explain why some legendary Pokémon withdraw from mortal contact entirely, isolating themselves in remote locations where they need not witness the endless cycle of brief friendships and inevitable loss. Lugia's retreat to the Whirl Islands after the Brass Tower fire could represent not just response to one tragedy, but recognition that involvement with mortals guarantees experiencing similar tragedies repeatedly. Withdrawal offers protection from pain, even as it ensures permanent loneliness. The concept of legendary Pokémon possessing trauma responses similar to those documented in humans and other intelligent species suggests they require psychological support systems that current society does not provide. No known mental health resources specifically address legendary Pokémon needs, partly because their rarity makes developing expertise nearly impossible, and partly because approaching legendary Pokémon to offer therapy presents obvious practical challenges. Some researchers propose that legendary Pokémon might provide psychological support to each other, forming social networks that remain invisible to human observation. The Lake Guardians' proximity to each other in Sinnoh, despite each having its own distinct territory, might reflect social bonding that helps them process their roles as cosmic forces governing knowledge, emotion, and willpower. Similarly, Reshiram and Zekrom's ancient connection might persist as mutual understanding even while they embody opposing philosophies. The question of whether legendary Pokémon experience concepts like friendship, love, or loyalty in ways comparable to human understanding remains philosophically complex. When Latios sacrifices itself to save Altomare in documented historical events, does that sacrifice reflect genuine love for the city and its inhabitants, or simply instinctive protective responses built into its nature? The distinction matters for understanding whether legendary Pokémon possess moral agency or operate more like sophisticated biological machines executing programmed behaviors. Evidence suggests legendary Pokémon do experience genuine emotion rather than merely simulating it. Mewtwo's existential crisis and eventual rage at its creators demonstrates capacity for complex emotional states that pure instinct cannot explain. The creature questioned its existence, grappled with identity issues, and made deliberate choices based on those philosophical struggles. Such behavior requires conscious awareness of self as distinct from automatic response to stimuli. The creation of artificial legendary Pokémon through human technology raises questions about what qualities define legendary status. If scientists could create new Mewtwo using refined cloning techniques, would each copy qualify as legendary, or does legendary status require uniqueness? Type: Null and its evolution. Silvally represent attempts to artificially create legendary tier Pokémon, with mixed results that suggest power alone does not grant legendary designation. Type: Null's design incorporated cells from multiple Pokémon types, attempting to replicate Arceus's ability to change types using different plates. The project succeeded in creating powerful Pokémon, but failed to match Arceus's cosmic significance or reality-shaping abilities. This limitation suggests legendary status involves factors beyond raw power, perhaps connection to universal forces, role in maintaining natural balance, or simply historical and cultural significance accumulated over millennia. The Ether Foundation's research into Ultra Beasts and artificial legendary Pokémon demonstrates both scientific ambition and ethical recklessness. Creating beings with legendary tier power without understanding their psychological needs or social requirements inevitably produces suffering. Type: Null's existence in containment, wearing a control mask to suppress its power, epitomizes the cruelty of creating life solely as an experimental tool without considering that life's welfare. Silvalley's evolution from type Null occurs only when the Pokémon forms strong bonds with a trainer, suggesting the species possesses capacity for connection despite its artificial origins. This emotional development challenges assumptions that laboratory-created Pokémon necessarily lack authentic feelings or cannot form genuine relationships. Silvally demonstrates that origin matters less than experience in determining whether beings develop consciousness and agency. The ethics of creating new life through technology versus natural breeding generates ongoing debate in Pokémon scientific communities. Traditional breeding allows Pokémon to reproduce according to their own biological patterns, with the offspring developing naturally through established evolutionary processes. Artificial creation through cloning or genetic engineering imposes human design preferences onto life forms that cannot consent to their own creation or modification. Mewtwo's famous question, "I see now that the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. It is what you do with the gift of life that determines who you are," provides one philosophical framework for addressing creation ethics. Under this interpretation, whether beings originate naturally or artificially matters less than how they exercise agency once they exist. But this framework assumes all created beings receive fair opportunity to develop agency, which type Null's treatment demonstrates cannot be guaranteed. The question of whether humans should create legendary Pokémon at all, regardless of how ethically the process might be conducted, challenges anthropocentric assumptions about humanity's right to reshape nature. Even if scientists could create legendary Pokémon without causing suffering, does that capability imply permission to exercise it? Some argue that creating new life represents humanity's highest calling, an extension of the creative impulse that drives all art and innovation. Others contend that creating beings designed to be more powerful than their creators demonstrates dangerous hubris. Historical precedents suggest caution regarding human attempts to control or create legendary power. The ultimate weapon of Kalos, Galactic's Red Chain, and Plasma's attempted exploitation of Reshiram and Zekrom all share a pattern where human ambition to master legendary power leads to catastrophic failure. These failures might indicate fundamental incompatibility between mortal understanding and cosmic forces that legendary Pokémon embody. Yet some humans throughout history have successfully partnered with legendary Pokémon without causing disaster, suggesting cooperation remains possible even if domination does not. The ancient hero who partnered with the original dragon before it split into Reshiram and Zekrom apparently maintained healthy relationship until the natural death ended the partnership. This historical example demonstrates that human legendary bonds can work when founded on mutual respect rather than desire for control. The criteria legendary Pokémon use when deciding whether to partner with humans remain mysterious, but patterns suggest they value qualities beyond simple strength. Many legendary partnered trainers throughout history demonstrated compassion, wisdom, and willingness to sacrifice personal gain for greater good. These traits might resonate with legendary Pokémon, who themselves serve cosmic purposes that require subordinating individual desires to larger responsibilities. Suicune's behavior in Johto provides documented example of legendary Pokémon deliberately testing potential partners. The legendary beast travels across the region, observing trainers from distance and occasionally engaging them in battle to assess their character and abilities. Only after extensive evaluation does Suicune approach a trainer openly, and even then, the partnership remains provisional, with Suicune retaining freedom to leave if the relationship proves unsatisfactory. This evaluative process suggests legendary Pokémon possess sophisticated assessment capabilities, reading not just surface behaviors, but deeper character traits that predict long-term compatibility. A trainer might successfully deceive other humans about their intentions, but legendary Pokémon apparently perceive authenticity or its absence directly. This perception might operate through psychic abilities, extraordinary observational skills, or access to information channels humans cannot detect. The existence of shadow Pokémon, creatures whose hearts have been artificially closed, making them more powerful but emotionally stunted, demonstrates that Pokémon can be corrupted through technology in ways that destroy their essential nature. If ordinary Pokémon can suffer this corruption, legendary Pokémon likely face similar vulnerability despite their power. The moral imperative to protect legendary Pokémon from exploitation extends beyond preventing habitat destruction to preventing psychological and spiritual harm through forced transformation or control. Cypher's Shadow Pokemon creation process in Ori region involved deliberately traumatizing Pokemon and then closing their hearts to prevent emotional healing. This procedure produced battle-ready creatures that fought without mercy or hesitation, but lost everything that made them individuals rather than biological weapons. That humans could conceive and execute such cruelty demonstrates the darkness that civilization can embrace when power takes priority over compassion. The existence of purification. Chambers capable of reversing shadow Pokemon corruption proves the process is not permanent, but healing requires extensive time and care. Shadow Pokemon must slowly relearn emotional connection, rediscovering capacity for trust, affection, and vulnerability that forced closure destroyed. This recovery process parallels trauma therapy in humans, with patient, consistent support gradually restoring mental health after severe psychological damage. If legendary Pokemon ever underwent Shadow Pokemon transformation, the results could prove catastrophic. A corrupted Dialga could destabilize time itself, creating temporal paradoxes or freezing the universe in a single eternal moment. A Shadow Palkia might collapse spatial dimensions, compressing infinite space into a singular point or fragmenting reality into unreachable pocket dimensions. The cosmic responsibilities these beings carry make their corruption the unthinkable, yet their power would make them prime targets for any group seeking ultimate control. Defense against legendary Pokemon corruption requires not just preventing physical capture, but protecting them from psychological manipulation and technological exploitation. Current legal frameworks address the physical threats reasonably well in most regions, but psychological and technological threats receive less attention. Development of new technologies that could affect legendary Pokemon minds or spirits requires proactive regulation rather than reactive response after damage occurs. The question of whether legendary Pokemon possess souls in the spiritual sense or operate as conscious but fundamentally material beings affects how their welfare gets conceptualized. If legendary Pokemon have souls that persisted after physical death, then destruction of their bodies might not constitute true death, merely forced transition to different existence state. But if consciousness depends entirely on physical form, killing legendary Pokemon becomes absolute annihilation of beings whose perspectives span millennia. Religious traditions across regions generally affirm legendary Pokemon possess souls, treating them as spiritual beings comparable to angels or divine messengers rather than animals. This theological position provides strong motivation for protecting legendary Pokemon beyond pragmatic concerns about ecological disruption. If legendary Pokemon are sacred beings, harming them represents blasphemy, regardless of whether that harm produces practical negative consequences. Scientific perspectives on legendary Pokemon consciousness and potential soul existence remain divided. Some researchers argue consciousness emerges from physical brain processes, making souls unnecessary explanatory concepts even for beings as powerful as legendary Pokemon. Others contend that legendary Pokemon display properties that purely material consciousness cannot explain, such as Celebi's time travel or Dialga's ability to perceive in all temporal moments simultaneously. The interaction between scientific and religious frameworks for understanding legendary Pokemon creates productive tension that advances both knowledge and wisdom. Science provides tools for studying legendary Pokemon behavior, abilities, and biology, while religion offers ethical frameworks for determining how that knowledge should be applied. Neither approach alone proves sufficient for addressing the full complexity of legendary Pokemon existence. Educational systems and regions with significant legendary Pokémon activity must decide how to teach children about these beings. Should legendary Pokémon be presented primarily as powerful creatures requiring caution and respect, or as potential partners for those who develop sufficient skill and character? The framing chosen influences how each generation approaches legendary encounters, shaping cultural attitudes that persist across lifetimes. Sinnoh's educational system emphasizes legendary Pokémon's religious significance, teaching creation myths before introducing scientific information about the being's observed behaviors and abilities. This approach roots children in cultural tradition while acknowledging that legendary Pokémon can be studied empirically. The balance between reverence and knowledge helps students understand legendary Pokémon as simultaneously sacred and real, worthy of worship and scientific investigation both. Unova's schools focus more on the philosophical questions raised by legendary Pokémon existence, using Reshiram and Zekrom as case studies in competing values and the challenge of determining truth. Students learn that legendary Pokémon embody abstract concepts given physical form, making them living arguments in ongoing philosophical debates. This approach encourages critical thinking about values and meaning rather than simply memorizing facts about legendary species. The impact of encountering legendary Pokémon varies dramatically based on individual psychological preparation, cultural context, and the specific legendary involved. A person raised in Sinnoh who encounters Arceus after years of religious devotion might experience the meeting as spiritual fulfillment, confirmation of beliefs maintained through faith. Someone without that background, encountering the same being, might feel terror or confusion, unable to process the experience through available mental frameworks. Documented cases of humans experiencing psychological breakdown after legendary encounters suggest these meetings can overwhelm cognitive systems not equipped to process such extreme stimuli. A person who sees Giratina emerge from the distortion world witnesses reality itself fracturing, with physical laws suspended and space-time becoming fluid. The human brain evolved to navigate stable environments with consistent rules, making perception of spaces where those rules do not apply potentially traumatic. Some regions offer mental health support specifically for individuals who have encountered legendary Pokémon, recognizing that such experiences require specialized counseling. Therapists trained in legendary encounter trauma help patients integrate their experiences, finding ways to make sense of what they witnessed without dismissing it as hallucination or allowing it to destabilize their entire worldview. This specialized care acknowledges that encountering cosmic beings produces genuine psychological impact, requiring professional intervention. The phenomenon of people claiming false, legendary encounters creates additional complexity for support systems. Some individuals fabricate stories for attention or status, while others genuinely believe they encountered legendary Pokémon when they actually experienced something more mundane. Distinguishing authentic encounters from false ones requires careful evaluation, as dismissing real experiences causes harm, while validating false ones wastes resources and undermines credibility of support systems. Physical evidence of legendary encounters provides strongest verification, but such evidence rarely survives. Legendary Pokémon appearances often involve reality distortion that prevents normal recording methods from functioning correctly. Cameras malfunction, memories become unreliable, and physical traces disappear more quickly than natural decay would explain. These evidentiary challenges mean many genuine encounters cannot be proven to skeptical observers, despite the experiencer's certainty about what occurred. The cultural impact of legendary Pokémon extends into art, literature, music, and virtually every form of creative expression across all regions. Artists attempt to capture legendary Pokemon's majesty or terror through painting, sculpture, and multimedia installations. Writers craft stories, exploring what legendary existence might feel like from the beings' perspectives. Musicians compose pieces inspired by legendary Pokemon, trying to evoke the emotions their power generates in witnesses. Legendary Pokemon appear as recurring symbols in regional folklore, representing abstract concepts through concrete imagery. Kyogre symbolizes the ocean's creative and destructive power, reminding coastal peoples that the sea gives life while occasionally reclaiming what it gave. Groudon represents land's stability and productivity, solid ground that supports civilization but can also split open and swallow those who grow too complacent. These symbolic meanings layer onto legendary Pokemon's literal existence, making them function simultaneously as real beings and metaphors. The artistic representations of legendary Pokemon rarely capture their true appearance or power according to people who have encountered them directly. Artists, working from descriptions or brief glimpses, produce approximations that convey general form without capturing the overwhelming presence legendary Pokemon project. This representational failure reflects limitations of human perception and artistic media rather than artists' inadequate skill. Some experiences resist representation through available tools. Legendary Pokemon occasionally appear in dreams more frequently than in waking life for most people. These dream encounters might represent a psychological processing of legendary Pokemon's cultural significance, subconscious minds exploring what these beings mean through symbolic dream imagery. Alternatively, some traditions hold that legendary Pokemon can communicate through dreams, their consciousness reaching across distances to deliver messages to individuals who need guidance or warning. Cresselia and Darkrai's abilities to influence dreams raise questions about whether other legendary Pokemon possess similar capabilities they simply use less frequently. If legendary Pokemon can access dreams, they possess communication channel that bypasses normal spatial limitations and allows contact without requiring physical manifestation. This dream connection might explain why so many cultures develop detailed legendary Pokemon mythologies, even in regions where physical sightings occur rarely. The relationship between legendary Pokemon and human architecture reveals how civilizations adapt to cosmic forces they cannot control. Temples built at power spots or legendary territories serve multiple functions: worship spaces, monitoring stations, and sometimes containment structures designed to limit legendary movement or influence. The architecture itself often incorporates symbolic elements referencing the legendary being it relates to, creating buildings that function as three-dimensional prayers or offerings. Spear Pillar's design exemplifies this symbolic architecture, with stone pillars arranged to represent Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina's relationship to each other and to Arceus. The temple's orientation aligns with celestial events, creating moments when sun or moonlight strikes specific points and patterns that ancient builders considered spiritually significant. Modern architects studying these alignments recognize sophistication that suggests advanced astronomical knowledge and engineering capability. The construction of legendary-focused architecture required resources and labor that only organized civilizations could provide, meaning temples mark locations where human society achieved sufficient stability and surplus to invest in religious infrastructure. The distribution of these structures across regions maps ancient civilization centers, with temple density correlating to historical population concentrations and political power centers. Some temples fell into ruin as civilizations declined or relocated, but the legendary Pokémon they honored continued existing independently of human recognition. This independence demonstrates that while legendary Pokémon might appreciate worship or benefit from offerings, they do not depend on human support for their basic existence. The beings persist with or without temples, remembered or forgotten, worshipped or ignored. The question of whether legendary Pokémon should be considered people rather than simply powerful creatures challenges legal and philosophical systems built on human centrism. If legendary Pokémon possess intelligence equal to or exceeding human capability, conscious awareness of their own existence, and capacity to make moral choices, what justifies treating them as fundamentally different from humans in legal and ethical frameworks? Personhood criteria used to determine human rights, consciousness, self-awareness, ability to suffer, capacity for reasoning and choice, apply as much or more to legendary Pokémon as to humans. Legendary Pokémon clearly think, feel, and make decisions based on complex evaluation of circumstances. They communicate, form relationships, and demonstrate concern for others' welfare. These capabilities suggest legendary Pokémon deserve recognition as persons with inherent rights rather than as animals subject to human authority. Extending personhood to legendary Pokémon would revolutionize human legendary relationships, requiring consent for capture rather than merely successful battle outcomes. A legendary Pokémon recognized as person could refuse partnership regardless of battle results, and forcing such partnership would constitute kidnapping rather than legitimate capture. This legal recognition would dramatically limit human ability to control legendary Pokémon, shifting power balance toward greater legendary autonomy. Resistance to legendary personhood comes partly from practical concerns about enforcement and partly from discomfort with implications for ordinary Pokémon. If legendary Pokémon deserve personhood due to their intelligence and autonomy, what about highly intelligent, non-legendary species like Alakazam or Metagross? Drawing lines between which Pokémon qualify as persons and which remain property creates uncomfortable precedents that many prefer avoiding, through denying personhood to all Pokémon regardless of capability. The alternative approach extends personhood to all Pokémon rather than limiting it to legendary species, treating every Pokémon as deserving basic rights and protections. This radical framework would transform Pokémon training from ownership to partnership, with Pokémon choosing to travel with trainers rather than being forced into service. While revolutionary, this approach aligns more closely with how many successful trainers already conceptualize their relationships with Pokémon teams. Evidence suggests Pokémon already exercise significant agency in relationships with trainers, choosing whether to obey commands, when to evolve, and how intensely to fight. Pokémon that disagree with trainers' decisions can refuse to battle, deliberately lose matches, or even abandon trainers entirely. This behavioral autonomy demonstrates that Pokémon already function as partners rather than property, in practice even when legal systems classify them as possessions. The gap between legal classification and practical reality regarding Pokémon agency creates ethical gray area where abuse can occur, but also where genuine partnerships flourish. Trainers who recognize their Pokémon's autonomy and build relationships based on mutual respect navigate this gray area successfully, while those who view Pokémon purely as tools violate the spirit of partnership even when adhering to legal requirements. Legendary Pokémon's role in maintaining environmental balance gives them additional claim to personhood recognition beyond individual capability arguments. These beings perform crucial ecological functions that benefit all life on the planet. Failing to recognize legendary Pokémon as persons with inherent value reduces them to natural resources to be managed rather than independent agents pursuing their own purposes while incidentally providing services others depend on. The concept of environmental personhood applied to legendary Pokémon would protect not just the beings themselves, but also the ecosystems they maintain. Damage to legendary habitats could be prosecuted as harm against persons rather than merely environmental destruction, potentially creating stronger legal mechanisms for conservation. This approach acknowledges that legendary Pokémon and their territories constitute integrated systems requiring protection as units rather than treating beings and habitats separately. International cooperation on legendary Pokémon conservation remains limited despite growing recognition that these beings' importance transcends regional boundaries. Kyogre's stirring affects global ocean currents, meaning its well-being concerns every region with coastline regardless of where the legendary actually dwells. Similarly, Rayquaza's role maintaining ozone layer stability makes it globally significant, despite residing primarily above Hoenn. Proposals for international legendary Pokémon protection treaties face political challenges as regions resist ceding sovereignty over beings within their territories. Some regions view their legendary Pokémon as national heritage or strategic resources whose control should not be shared with international bodies. This nationalist perspective conflicts with ecological reality that legendary Pokémon function as planetary rather than merely regional forces. The question of what humanity owes legendary Pokémon in exchange for the benefits their existence provides rarely receives serious consideration. Humans benefit enormously from legendary Pokémon maintaining time's flow, space's stability, and environmental balance, yet offer little in return beyond occasional worship and inconsistent habitat protection. This imbalance might reflect cosmic order where legendary Pokémon serve reality itself rather than humanity specifically, or it might represent exploitation that persists because legendary Pokémon lack mechanisms to demand compensation. Some philosophical traditions propose that humans owe legendary Pokémon gratitude, expressed through responsible stewardship of the world legendary Pokémon maintain. Under this framework, humans repay legendary Pokémon not directly, but by caring for the planet and other species, becoming partners in maintaining balance rather than passive recipients of legendary intervention. This interpretation transforms human legendary relationships from hierarchical to collaborative. The impact of climate change and environmental degradation on legendary Pokémon remains poorly studied despite obvious importance. If legendary Pokémon maintain ecological balance, what happens when human activity pushes systems so far out of balance that legendary intervention cannot restore equilibrium? Do legendary Pokémon possess limits beyond which they cannot operate effectively? And if so, has humanity already pushed some systems past those limits? Evidence suggests some legendary Pokémon are responding to environmental changes in ways that indicate stress or inability to maintain their usual functions. Migration patterns shift, appearances become less frequent or more erratic, and some legendary Pokémon demonstrate behavioral changes consistent with distress. These warning signs suggest that continued environmental degradation might compromise legendary Pokémon's ability to fulfill their cosmic responsibilities, potentially triggering cascading failures across interconnected systems. The scenario where legendary Pokémon can no longer maintain planetary systems they evolved to regulate represents existential threat, potentially exceeding any danger humanity has previously faced. Without Dialga's regulation, time might begin flowing inconsistently, creating zones where it moves faster or slower or stops entirely. Without Palkia's stabilization, space could fragment into unreachable pockets or collapse into singularities. The cosmic forces legendary Pokémon contain and direct would not disappear, but would operate chaotically, making reality itself unstable. Preventing this catastrophic scenario requires humanity recognizing dependence on legendary Pokémon and acting accordingly to preserve conditions these beings need to function effectively. This recognition demands humility from a species that prefers viewing itself as master of nature rather than one component in larger system. The shift from dominion to partnership paradigm challenges deeply held cultural assumptions, but becomes increasingly necessary as environmental pressures mount. Legendary Pokemon's documented lifespans, spanning millennia, mean they possess historical memory unavailable to shorter-lived species, including humans. A being that witnessed the rise and fall of ancient civilizations carries perspective on human achievement and failure that contemporary society ignores at its peril. And what patterns do legendary Pokémon recognize across historical cycles that humans miss due to generational amnesia, where each new cohort believes its challenges unprecedented? The Lake Guardians, having existed since reality's beginning, observed every human civilization from its emergence through its peak and eventual decline or transformation. They witnessed empires that believed themselves eternal crumble into ruins, saw technologies considered miraculous become commonplace, then obsolete, and watched ideologies proclaimed as universal truth fade into forgotten curiosity. This comprehensive historical view positions them as uniquely qualified advisors if humanity possessed humility to seek their counsel. But legendary Pokémon rarely offer unsolicited advice or intervention, their non-interference suggesting either respect for mortal autonomy or recognition that intervention rarely produces lasting beneficial change. Societies must navigate their own challenges and learn from their own mistakes, as wisdom gained through personal experience creates deeper understanding than lessons delivered by external authorities. Legendary Pokémon might intervene during existential crises, but otherwise allow civilizations to develop according to their own trajectories. The question of whether legendary Pokémon judge human civilization or remain neutral observers affects how humans interpret their occasional interventions. When Rayquaza descends to stop Kyogre and Gruden's battle, does it act from concern for human welfare, or does it simply maintain planetary balance, regardless of whether humans benefit? The distinction matters for understanding whether legendary Pokémon view themselves as protectors of humanity specifically, or guardians of broader ecological systems in which humans participate but do not necessarily hold special status. Evidence suggests different legendary Pokémon hold varying attitudes toward humanity, with some demonstrating clear protective instincts, while others maintain strict neutrality or even hostility. The Swords of Justice explicitly protect Pokémon from human exploitation, positioning themselves as defenders against humanity when necessary. The Lake Guardians seem more favorably disposed toward humans, occasionally assisting individuals who seek their wisdom. Giratina appears largely indifferent to human affairs, unless they threaten dimensional stability. This diversity of attitudes prevents generalizing about legendary Pokémon relationships with humanity, requiring case-by-case assessment of each being's disposition and priorities. A trainer hoping to partner with legendary Pokémon must understand not just the species' capabilities, but also its philosophical stance toward the mortal involvement, and whether it welcomes, tolerates, or rejects human contact under normal circumstances. The mythology surrounding legendary Pokémon continues evolving as new encounters add details to established knowledge and occasionally force revision of accepted understanding. Ancient texts provide foundation for legendary knowledge, but modern research generates information those texts could not anticipate. The synthesis of traditional wisdom and contemporary empiricism creates most complete picture available, while acknowledging significant gaps remain in comprehending beings whose existence transcends normal categorical frameworks. Future legendary Pokémon discoveries remain possible despite centuries of documentation and research. Remote regions, alternate dimensions, and unexplored depths of oceans or underground caverns might house legendary beings not yet encountered by humans, or known only through fragmentary evidence insufficient for confirmation. Each new legendary discovery forces reconsideration of creation mythology and evolutionary theory, demonstrating that understanding remains provisional rather than complete. The possibility that humanity might create new legendary Pokémon through sufficiently advanced technology raises questions about whether the category legendary can be artificially expanded or whether certain qualities remain inherently beyond technological reproduction. If legendary status derives solely from power and uniqueness, technology might eventually produce artificial legendaries indistinguishable from natural ones. But if legendary status requires connection to cosmic forces or spiritual dimensions that technology cannot access, artificial beings might achieve tremendous power while remaining fundamentally different from true legendaries. The gradual blurring of boundaries between natural and artificial, between legendary and ordinary, between cosmic and mundane, suggests that rigid categorical thinking proves inadequate for addressing realities of Pokémon existence. Beings defy simple classification, possessing combinations of traits that span categories rather than fitting neatly within them. This categorical ambiguity frustrates attempts at comprehensive taxonomies, but more accurately reflects the messy, complex nature of actual living systems. Legendary Pokémon exist at the intersection of multiple categories simultaneously: biological organisms and cosmic forces, individuals and embodiments of universal principles, mortal beings, and eternal concepts. This multivalence makes them endlessly fascinating subjects for study, while ensuring complete understanding remains perpetually out of reach. Each answer generates new questions. Each discovery reveals additional mysteries. Each conclusion proves provisional rather than final. The journey through legendary Pokémon mythology demonstrates how deeply these beings shaped the world humans and ordinary Pokémon inhabit. From Arceus's initial creative act through the ongoing maintenance work of regional guardians, legendary Pokémon provide essential services that allow life to flourish in stable, predictable conditions. Without their intervention, reality itself might prove too chaotic for complex life to develop or persist. Understanding this dependence should generate appreciation and protective instinct toward legendary Pokémon as beings whose welfare directly affects everyone else's continued existence. The temptation to exploit legendary power for short-term gain must be resisted in favor of long-term stewardship that preserves legendary Pokémon's ability to fulfill their cosmic functions. Humanity's survival depends on legendary Pokémon continuing their work, making their protection not altruism, but essential self-interest, properly understood. The stories told about legendary Pokémon across cultures and generations serve purposes beyond entertainment or education. They encode warnings about hubris, lessons about respect for forces beyond control, and reminders that power without wisdom leads to catastrophe. These narrative functions ensure that even populations who never directly encounter legendary Pokémon maintain appropriate caution and reverence toward beings whose displeasure could render entire regions uninhabitable. As human civilization advances technologically and expands territorially, pressure on legendary Pokémon and their habitats intensifies. The challenge facing current and future generations involves balancing legitimate human needs for resources and space against equally legitimate legendary Pokémon requirements for territory and autonomy. This balance becomes increasingly difficult to maintain as human population grows and environmental systems face mounting stress from multiple sources. Solutions exist, but require commitment to priorities beyond immediate economic gain or convenience. Preserving legendary habitats, restricting technologies that might harm or exploit legendary Pokémon, and developing frameworks that recognize legendary personhood and rights all represent achievable goals if pursued with dedication. The question is not whether humanity possesses capability to protect legendary Pokémon, but whether it maintains will to prioritize such protection when competing interests demand attention. The fate of legendary Pokémon ultimately intertwines with humanity's fate more completely than most people recognize. As guardians of fundamental forces, legendary Pokémon maintain conditions that make human civilization possible. Failing to protect them constitutes self-destructive behavior, regardless of whether ethical concerns about legendary welfare receive acknowledgement. Practical and moral imperatives align in demanding humanity extend to legendary Pokémon the respect, protection, and partnership their cosmic service has earned across millions of years of faithful guardianship. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you.